My father threw me out into the freezing rain when I was 18, calling my unborn son a mistake that would permanently ruin my life. 17 years later, my private estate security called to tell me that very same man was screaming at my front gate, demanding to speak to the property manager. I smiled at the security feed, picked up my cup of tea, and prepared to show the man who discarded me exactly who owned this $4 million estate. My name is Naomi, and I am 35 years old. I was sitting at my custom mahogany desk, overlooking the manicured lawns of my 4-acre property in the heart of Atlanta, when the chaos began. The afternoon sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office, warming the hardwood floors. I had spent the entire morning reviewing contracts and finalizing a massive commercial real estate acquisition for my luxury property management firm. It was a multi-million-dollar deal that would secure my son Jamal's future for generations. Jamal is the very same boy my father had deemed a worthless mistake all those years ago. I was just about to sign the final wire transfer authorization when the sharp buzz of the intercom shattered the quiet focus of my office. I pressed the button on my desk, expecting my executive assistant to confirm my afternoon schedule. Instead, it was my head of security, David. "Ma'am, I am so sorry to disturb you, but we have a situation at the main gate. There is a gentleman here in a leased sedan refusing to leave. He is becoming incredibly hostile and insists he needs to speak to the property manager immediately." I clicked a button on my keyboard, bringing up the high-definition video feed from the front gate cameras. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. There he was. Richard, my father. He looked older, and the gray in his hair was far more pronounced, but his posture carried the exact same arrogant and entitled weight that had terrified me as a child. He was leaning heavily out of the driver's side window of a mid-range car, his face flushed red with anger as he berated my security guard. In the passenger seat sat my mother Brenda, adjusting her designer sunglasses and looking deeply inconvenienced by the fact that they were being denied entry. In the back seat, I could just make out the silhouettes of my younger sister Jasmine and her husband Andre. I turned up the audio feed on my monitor. "Do you know who I am?" Richard was shouting while slamming his palm against the side of his car door. "I am not some delivery driver you can just turn away. I have it on good authority that the property manager of this estate lives in the main house, and I demand you let me through to speak with her. We are family, and she needs to arrange housing for us on this property right now. Open this gate before I call her boss and have you fired for insubordination." A cold and dry laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet of my office. He truly believed I was just the help. He had tracked down my business address, seen the sheer scale of the estate, and his immediate assumption was that I was merely an employee managing the grounds for someone wealthy. It was so perfectly Richard. In his mind, the pregnant teenager he had tossed onto the street with nothing but a black garbage bag of clothes could never rise above the station of a servant. He could not fathom that the name on the bronze plaque at the entrance stood for my holding company. Before I tell you what I did when I saw the man who threw me out into the cold 17 years ago, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you have ever had to block a toxic family member and build your own empire from the ground up. I sat back in my leather chair and let the memories wash over me, not with pain, but with a profound sense of triumph. When I was 18, terrified and staring down a positive pregnancy test, I had begged him for a few months of grace just to graduate high school. Instead, he told me I was a stain on his reputation and a burden he refused to carry. He told me I would amount to nothing but a statistic. Now he was the one begging at my reinforced steel gates, sweating in the Georgia heat. I leaned forward and watched the monitor closely. Andre stepped out of the back seat, trying his best to look intimidating. He was Jasmine's husband, a man who constantly bragged about his tech startups that never seemed to actually launch or make a single dime. He puffed out his chest and walked right up to the security kiosk. "Look, man," Andre said, trying to sound authoritative. "My father-in-law told you to open the gate. We are here to see Naomi. She works here, so tell her Jasmine needs one of the guest houses prepped because we are relocating. The sheer audacity of it all was almost intoxicating. They were being evicted. I knew it instantly because you do not show up unannounced at a luxury estate demanding a guest house unless you have absolutely nowhere else to go. Jasmine, the perpetual golden child who had her college fully funded and who received a brand new car for her graduation while I was working double shifts at a diner to buy diapers, was now looking to me for a bailout. I pressed the intercom button to speak directly to David, my security chief. "David, do not call the police just yet," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I am going to buzz them through the outer gate, but do not let them pass the driveway turnaround. Keep them exactly right there. I will be down in a moment to handle this personally." "Understood, ma'am," David replied, his professional tone never wavering. I stood up from my desk and smoothed the fabric of my tailored designer suit. I slipped my diamond watch onto my wrist, the cool metal serving as a grounding reminder of every grueling hour, every sleepless night, and every brilliant investment I had made over the last decade and a half to get to this exact moment. I walked out of my office and descended the grand sweeping staircase of my home. My heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floors, with each step echoing the power I had reclaimed. I was not the frightened and weeping girl they had discarded. I was the architect of my own destiny, and they were trespassing in my kingdom. I reached the massive mahogany front doors, pulled them open, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, ready to give them the welcome they truly deserved. The tires of the leased silver sedan crunched against the imported gravel of my circular driveway before coming to an abrupt halt near the central fountain. I stood perfectly still at the base of the grand stone steps leading up to the main house. I crossed my arms over my chest and waited. I had no intention of inviting any of them inside. The heavy oak doors behind me were firmly shut and locked. Richard slammed the driver's side door and marched toward me. He stopped a few feet away, looking me up and down with that familiar expression of absolute disdain. His eyes raked over my tailored navy blue suit, the silk blouse and the diamond studs in my ears. He let out a harsh and mocking scoff. "Glad to see you finally got a decent job managing this place, Naomi," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "It certainly beats crying on my porch begging for diaper money." There it was, the jab he had kept holstered for 17 years. He threw it out there casually, expecting me to shrink back into the terrified teenager I used to be. The memory flashed behind my eyes for a split second. The freezing November rain soaking through my thin jacket, the heavy black trash bag filled with my only belongings, and the sound of his deadbolt clicking shut while I stood heavily pregnant on his front porch. But the woman standing before him today did not flinch. I just looked back at him, my expression completely unreadable. Before I could even respond, the passenger door clicked open. My mother, Brenda, stepped out into the sunlight. She did not look at me. She did not say hello. Instead, she immediately began pacing the perimeter of the driveway, her eyes darting greedily over the manicured hedges, the perfectly trimmed azaleas, and the sprawling stone facade of the mansion. I could practically see the calculator running in her head, tallying up the property value and wondering how she could spin this to her country club friends. She reached out and ran her hand along the edge of the tiered bronze fountain, acting as though she was inspecting the quality of the craftsmanship. "It is a lovely property," she said loudly, speaking to the air rather than to me. "The owners must be away for the season. We will just stay in the main guest quarters since the primary residence is likely locked up." Then the back doors of the sedan swung open. Out stepped my younger sister Jasmine and her husband Andre. Jasmine stretched her arms above her head and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. She was dressed in a loud designer label outfit that screamed of credit card debt. "Good grief," she complained, brushing non-existent dust off her pants. "That drive felt like it took hours. Why on earth is this estate so far off the main highway? The security gate process is absolutely ridiculous. You need to talk to your boss about streamlining that for family members, Naomi." Andre slammed the door behind him and swaggered over to join Richard. He looked around with an arrogant smirk, nodding his head as if he were inspecting a property he had just purchased. "Not bad," Andre said, sliding his hands into his pockets. "I mean, the landscaping is a little traditional for my taste, but it will do. Jasmine and I need a place with decent square footage for my new home office. I am launching a major software integration platform next month, and I need absolute quiet." I stood there listening to the sheer delusion spilling from their mouths. They had driven onto a property they did not own uninvited, and were already dividing up the living spaces and critiquing the landscaping. Jasmine walked right past me, heading for the stone steps. "Well, do not just stand there in the sun, Naomi," she snapped, waving her hand at me dismissively. "Open up the guest house. Andre and I have luggage in the trunk, and we are absolutely exhausted." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my feet firmly planted on the pavement and stared directly into Jasmine's eyes. "You are not moving in," I said. My voice was quiet, but the absolute authority in it echoed across the open courtyard. "You are not staying in the guest house. You are not staying in the main house. In fact, you are not staying on this property at all." Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks. She turned around to face me, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in genuine confusion. "Excuse me," she asked, placing a hand on her hip. "What did you just say to me?" Richard stepped forward, his face instantly turning a deep shade of red. He pointed a thick finger right at my face. "You listen to me right now," he barked. "Your sister and her husband are going through a transitional period. Their condo building is undergoing massive renovations, and they need a place to stay immediately. You manage a property with 4 empty buildings on it. You are going to give them the keys to one of the secondary houses right now, or so help me God, I will call the estate owner and have you thrown out on the street just like I did before." The threat hung in the warm air. He thought he held all the cards. He believed he possessed the power to destroy my livelihood with a single phone call. He was banking on the fear of a desperate employee to force my hand. I took one slow and deliberate step down toward him. "A transitional period," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue. "Is that what we are calling an eviction these days?" Jasmine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Andre's arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Richard's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward Andre before snapping back to me. "How dare you!" Richard shouted, taking another aggressive step toward me. "You know absolutely nothing about their financial situation. You are going to open those doors, and you are going to do it right now because family helps family." "Family helps family," I repeated, nodding slowly. "That is a fascinating philosophy, Richard. I am curious, though. Where was that philosophy when I was living in my car, eating saltines for dinner so I could afford prenatal vitamins? Where was that philosophy when you forced me to forge a signature on a hospital admission form because you dropped me off at the emergency room and drove away?" Brenda finally turned away from the fountain and looked at me, her expression hardening. "Do not be dramatic, Naomi," she snapped, her voice sharp and scolding. "We used tough love to make you strong. You were a rebellious teenager who made a massive mistake. We did what we had to do to protect this family. You should be thanking us. Look at you now. You have a good job. You owe your work ethic to the boundaries we set. Now stop being so petty and bitter over ancient history and help your sister." The gaslighting was almost poetic in its perfection. They were literally trying to take credit for the success I built out of the trauma they inflicted. They wanted to harvest the fruits of the tree they had tried to chop down. I let out a slow and steady breath. The time for observation was over. The trap was perfectly set, and they had walked right into the center of it with their eyes wide open. I looked right past Brenda and focused my attention on Jasmine. "If you are so successful and Andre is on the brink of launching a massive software platform, why exactly are your belongings stuffed into the trunk of a leased vehicle?" I asked. Jasmine crossed her arms, her designer bangles clinking together. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue," she muttered, avoiding my gaze. "Andre had a falling out with his angel investors. They completely messed up his Series A funding round. Our building management at the condo is being completely unreasonable about a few missed payments. We have to be out by Friday." Andre puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his bruised ego. The market is just volatile right now, Naomi. My app is going to revolutionize urban logistics. I just need a solid 6 months of zero overhead to finish coding the beta version. You have all these empty buildings sitting here collecting dust. It makes perfect business sense for us to utilize one of the guest houses until my valuation spikes. I stared at him, letting the sheer stupidity of his statement hang in the air. You want me to illegally move you into a multi-million-dollar guest house so you can play tech entrepreneur rent-free? I asked, my voice dangerously level. Richard stepped right into my personal space, his face flushed with impatience. Do not use that tone with us, he commanded. You are the property manager. You have the security codes and the master keys. The owner probably only visits this place a few weeks out of the year. You can quietly move your sister into the pool house and no one will be the wiser. He was actually demanding that I risk my livelihood, my reputation, and potentially face criminal trespassing charges just to shield his favorite daughter from the consequences of her own financial ruin. And what happens if the owner decides to drop by unannounced? I asked, tilting my head. What happens if I am caught harboring squatters and I lose my job? Richard waved his hand as if swatting away a fly. Then you find another management gig, he said callously. You have experience now. It is a small price to pay to keep your sister from sleeping in a motel. Stop being so selfish. There it was. The absolute core of our family dynamic laid bare on my driveway. My entire career, my stability, and my future were completely disposable to him as long as it served Jasmine's needs. I was expected to set myself on fire just to keep her warm. I looked at the three of them standing there demanding the keys to a kingdom they had no right to enter. I am not giving you the keys, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that brooked no argument. I am not risking my position for people who threw me away like garbage. You will have to find your zero overhead somewhere else, Andre. Jasmine let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. Mom, tell her to stop being so hateful, Jasmine whined, stomping her foot like a petulant toddler. Brenda sighed heavily, putting on the face of a disappointed and exhausted matriarch. She walked up the stone steps and stopped right in front of me, looking into my eyes with a manufactured sadness. Naomi family helps family, she said, her voice dripping with toxic sweetness. Do not be bitter just because your path was harder. You made your bed at 18. We made the difficult choice to let you lie in it so you would learn responsibility. And clearly it worked. Now it is your turn to show some grace. Jasmine has never faced a hardship like this before. She does not have your thick skin. My thick skin. The skin they had repeatedly battered and bruised with their neglect and blatant favoritism. They genuinely believed that because I survived their cruelty, I owed them the rewards of my survival. She wanted to rebrand their abandonment as a calculated parenting strategy. You are absolutely right, Brenda, I said, using her first name to shatter the illusion that she held any maternal authority over me. I made my bed at 18. I built it from the ground up while sleeping in parking lots and working back-to-back shifts. And now I sleep very peacefully in it. But Jasmine made her bed too, and she can go sleep in it wherever that happens to be. Richard lunged forward, grabbing my forearm. Listen to me, you ungrateful brat, he spat, his grip tightening painfully. I am your father. I am telling you to open those doors right now. I have half a mind to call your employer right this second and tell them how you treat your own flesh and blood. They will fire you before sunset. I looked down at his hand gripping my sleeve and then looked back up into his furious eyes. My pulse did not elevate. My breathing remained steady. I had waited a decade and a half for this exact sequence of events. I yanked my arm out of his grasp with enough force to make him stumble backward. Go ahead, I challenged, gesturing toward his pocket. Pull out your phone, Richard. Call the owner of this estate. Let us see exactly who gets fired today. Richard pulled his phone from his jacket pocket, his face twisted in a sneer of absolute triumph. He held the device up as if it were a weapon. Fine. He snapped his thumb aggressively, jabbing at the screen to unlock it. What is the number? Give me the owner's direct line right now, Naomi. I am going to make sure you do not even have a severance package by the time I am done with you. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a sleek, metallic business card, holding it out between my index and middle fingers. Richard snatched it from my hand with a violent jerk. He lowered his eyes to the card, squinting at the embossed silver lettering. I watched his eyes scan the words NW Holdings, followed by Chief Executive Officer, and then finally my full legal name. I raised my hand and pointed toward the heavy bronze plaque mounted on the stone pillar by the main security gate. NW Holdings, I said slowly, letting every single syllable land like a physical blow in the heavy afternoon air. You want to speak to the owner of this $4 million estate, Richard. Her number is in my pocket. But you can save your breath because you are looking right at her. The silence that fell over the driveway was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that follows a lightning strike just before the thunder hits. Richard lowered the phone slowly. The angry, aggressive flush in his cheeks drained away instantly, leaving his face a pale, sickly gray. He looked from the expensive metallic business card to the sprawling stone mansion behind me, and then back to my face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jasmine let out a nervous, breathless laugh, breaking the silence. "Shut up, Naomi," she stammered, crossing her arms defensively against her chest. "You do not own this place. You are just a property manager. Mom, tell her to stop lying. It is a pathetic joke." But Brenda was not looking at Jasmine. My mother was staring at the intricate stonework of the mansion, the massive custom oak doors, and the perfectly maintained grounds. Her eyes widened as the reality of my wealth finally registered in her brain. I could practically see the gears violently shifting in her head. The daughter she had written off as collateral damage, the scapegoat she had abandoned to protect her social standing, was standing in front of her as a self-made millionaire. Suddenly her posture softened, and a sickeningly sweet, calculating light entered her eyes. Andre took a physical step backward, his unearned bravado completely evaporating. He looked at me with the sudden mix of awe and predatory calculation, realizing he had just spent the last 5 minutes insulting the only person capable of funding his failing ventures. Before any of them could formulate a coherent sentence to salvage the wreckage of their pride, the heavy wrought iron gates at the bottom of the driveway began to swing open. The smooth, silent hum of an electric engine filled the air. A sleek, midnight black Tesla Model S glided up the paved path, pulling to a gentle stop right behind their leased and dusty sedan. Every head turned. The driver's side door clicked open, and the chauffeur, a distinguished man in a sharp gray suit, stepped out to open the rear passenger door. Out stepped a tall, striking young man. He was 16 years old, but carried himself with the quiet, focused confidence of someone much older. He was wearing the navy blue blazer of Atlanta's most elite private preparatory school, the gold crest embroidered proudly on his chest. His tie was perfectly knotted, and his heavy leather backpack was slung effortlessly over one shoulder. He paused on the gravel, assessing the strange scene on his driveway. He looked at the cheap leased car blocking the turnaround, and then at the 4 unfamiliar faces staring back at him with open-mouthed shock. Finally, his eyes found mine, and a warm, easy smile broke across his face. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the tension. "Sorry I'm a little late. Calculus Club ran over and traffic on the perimeter was a nightmare." I smiled back at him, feeling a surge of fierce protective pride that threatened to crack my ribs. "You are right on time, Jamal," I said, keeping my eyes locked on him. At the sound of that name, Richard physically stumbled backward, as if he had been shoved in the chest. Jamal, the mistake, the burden, the unborn child Richard said would ruin my life forever and drain me of any potential. The baby he demanded I terminate or face the streets. Richard stared at my son, completely paralyzed. He took in the expensive tailored school uniform, the perfect posture, and the undeniable intelligence radiating from this young man. He looked at the luxury electric vehicle and the private driver. He realized in one crushing, devastating instant that the teenager standing before him was not a tragic statistic. He was the sole heir to a massive real estate empire. Brenda lifted a trembling hand to her mouth, letting out a tiny muffled gasp. Jasmine just stared, her jaw practically unhinged, her eyes darting frantically between my tailored suit and my son's elite school uniform. Jamal walked over to me, standing tall by my side. He glanced at the group of strangers invading our space. He did not know their faces, because I had never allowed their toxic presence to poison a single day of his childhood. To him, they were just uninvited guests, causing a disturbance at our home. "Is everything all right here, Mom?" Jamal asked, looking directly at Richard with a sharp, analytical gaze. "Do we need to have David and the security team escort them out?" I looked at my father, watching him drown in the realization of his own catastrophic miscalculation. He had thrown away a diamond because he was too ignorant to recognize its worth. He had chosen his own pride over his daughter and his grandson. And now he was standing on my driveway, a desperate beggar at the gates of the empire that very same mistake had built. "Everything is perfectly fine, Jamal," I answered, my voice smooth and completely devoid of pity. These people were just leaving. But of course they were not going anywhere. The greed had already set in, and I knew the real games were just about to begin. The realization of my wealth hit them like a physical wave, altering their entire demeanor in a matter of seconds. The hostility and the aggressive entitlement vanished completely. In its place, a sickeningly sweet and desperate affection washed over my mother's face. Brenda took a step forward, her hands clasped together tightly against her chest, as if she were looking at a profound miracle, instead of the grandson she had once demanded I abort. "Oh my goodness," she cooed, her voice trembling with forced and fabricated emotion. "Jamal, look at you. Look how incredibly handsome you are. You have grown into such an outstanding young man. Come here and give your grandmother a hug." She moved in quickly with her arms wide open, anticipating the emotional family reunion she had just constructed in her head. Jamal did not even blink. With the effortless and casual grace of a trained athlete, he simply took one step to the right, smoothly sidestepping her embrace. He kept his hands comfortably resting at his sides, his posture relaxed, but entirely unapproachable. "It is nice to meet you," he said. His voice was polite and respectful, but entirely devoid of any warmth. "I am not much of a hugger, ma'am." Brenda stumbled slightly, her arms grasping empty air, before she quickly dropped them to her sides. She recovered by letting out a high-pitched, nervous laugh and patting her own collarbone. Of course," she babbled, her eyes darting around frantically. "You are a teenager. Boys your age are far too cool for hugs. I completely understand." Richard stepped forward next, his entire posture completely transformed. The aggressive tyrant who had just grabbed my arm and threatened my livelihood was gone. Now he stood with his shoulders slightly rounded, wearing a wide apologetic smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Naomi," he began, his voice thick with a sudden manufactured humility. "I think we got off on the wrong foot here today. The afternoon heat is getting to everyone, and tensions are running high because of Jasmine's unfortunate housing situation. We are family. We should not be arguing on a driveway like a group of strangers." I looked at him, watching the desperate and rapid calculation behind his eyes. He was already trying to rewrite the narrative. He was already positioning himself to gain access to the fortress he had just realized existed. "You are right, Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and completely unreadable. "It is entirely too hot to stand out here in the sun. Why do you not all come inside? We can have a glass of iced water before you get back on the highway to figure out your living arrangements." Jasmine perked up instantly, her eyes lighting up with unfiltered greed. "Oh, thank God," she breathed, fanning her face with her hand. "I am absolutely parched." I turned my back to them and walked up the wide stone steps, unlocking the heavy custom oak double doors. I pushed them open and stepped into the cool air-conditioned sanctuary of my foyer. I did not hold the door open for them. I simply walked in and let them trail behind me like a pack of desperate strays following a meal. The moment they crossed the threshold, the sheer scale of the estate hit them all over again. The foyer boasted 30-foot ceilings with a massive contemporary crystal chandelier suspended in the center, catching the afternoon sunlight and scattering brilliant prisms across the imported white marble floors. A grand sweeping staircase with intricate wrought iron detailing led up to the second-floor gallery. Modern minimalist art hung on the pristine walls, featuring pieces that cost more than the luxury cars they were currently leasing. The air smelled faintly of fresh lilies and expensive cedar. I stood near the entrance of the formal living room, crossing my arms and simply watching them. I let them inside not out of any lingering sense of familial duty or sudden forgiveness. I let them in purely to observe their desperation. I wanted them to see exactly what they had thrown away. I wanted them to touch the luxury they would never be allowed to possess. Brenda was practically vibrating with excitement. She walked slowly toward a large bronze sculpture near the staircase, her fingers hovering just inches from the surface, afraid to touch it, but desperate to claim it. "Naomi, this is magnificent," she whispered, her eyes wide, taking in the architectural details. "The interior design is absolutely flawless. Did you decorate this all by yourself?" "Every single inch," I replied simply. Richard was inspecting the custom crown molding and the thickness of the baseboards, his background in the construction business clearly kicking in. His eyes were darting rapidly, calculating square footage and high-end material costs. "You know this place has incredible bones, Naomi," he said, running his rough hand along a structural pillar. "You have done very well for yourself." "Very well indeed. Of course it takes a sharp analytical eye to manage an asset like this. I always knew you had a strong head for business. You definitely get that from me." I pressed my lips together to keep from laughing out loud. He was actually trying to claim credit for the empire I built, from the ashes of the life he burned to the ground. Jasmine and Andre walked in last. Jasmine immediately gravitated toward the formal living room, staring at the custom Italian leather sectionals, the silk Persian rugs, and the massive floor-to-ceiling marble fireplace. Her jealousy was a tangible living thing radiating off her in heavy waves. She looked down at her own designer outfit, suddenly hyper-aware that her clothes were bought on maxed-out credit cards, while the entire estate she was standing in was purchased with cash. "Wow," Jasmine muttered, sinking her teeth into her bottom lip. "This is so unnecessary. Who even needs this much space for just two people? It seems incredibly wasteful, Naomi." Andre nudged her sharply in the ribs, flashing me a tight, apologetic grimace. "What Jasmine means is that it is a very impressive portfolio piece," Andre corrected quickly, trying to sound like a seasoned investor. "Really beautiful work, Naomi. It shows incredible liquid capital." I watched them mentally dividing up my property right in front of me. I could see Jasmine calculating which wing of the house she would demand for herself and her husband. I could see Andre eyeing the expansive property outside the panoramic windows, undoubtedly wondering how much capital I could seamlessly inject into his failing ventures. They were infected with the parasitic belief that my success was somehow their safety net. "Make yourselves comfortable," I said, gesturing toward the living room seating area. "I will have my private chef bring out some refreshments for everyone." Brenda whipped her head around, her eyes practically bulging out of her skull. "Your private chef?" She repeated the words, rolling off her tongue like a sacred prayer. "You have private household staff living here." I just smiled, a cold, tight smile that offered absolutely zero comfort. "I have everything I need, Brenda," I said softly. "Please take a seat. We have a lot of catching up to do." Within 20 minutes, my private chef Carter had assembled an impromptu but immaculate spread in the formal dining room. I guided my uninvited guests into the space where a massive custom mahogany dining table stretched beneath a modern geometric chandelier. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling wine cellars encased in temperature-controlled glass. I took my seat at the head of the table. Jamal sat immediately to my right, his posture perfect, his expression completely unreadable. Richard naturally tried to take the seat at the opposite head of the table, attempting to assert some kind of patriarchal dominance over the room. Brenda sat next to him while Jasmine and Andre practically sprinted to the remaining chairs, eyeing the heavy silver cutlery and fine china. Carter moved silently around the room, serving plates of pan-seared scallops over saffron risotto with a delicate citrus glaze. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the clinking of silverware against porcelain. My family ate with a ravenous, aggressive speed that betrayed their desperate financial reality. Jasmine, who always claimed to have a refined palate, practically inhaled her food, dropping pieces of risotto onto the pristine white tablecloth. Andre ate with his head down, completely ignoring his wife. Brenda took smaller bites, but her eyes never stopped moving, constantly evaluating the value of the crystal water goblets and the linen napkins. I barely touched my food. I simply sat there watching them feast on the luxury they felt entirely entitled to. When Richard finally wiped his mouth with his napkin, he leaned back in his heavy leather dining chair and let out a satisfied sigh. He folded his hands over his stomach and looked down the length of the table at me. The arrogant swagger had fully returned to his posture, fueled by a hot meal and the delusion that he was somehow responsible for the wealth surrounding him. "This is quite the setup," Naomi Richard began, his voice booming in the quiet room. "I have to admit, I am incredibly impressed. Not many people could pull themselves up from the situation you were in and achieve this level of corporate success. But you know, I always said you had the hardest head in the family. You just needed the right motivation to unlock your potential." He paused, taking a slow, dramatic sip of his water before delivering the ultimate revision of our shared history. He looked at me with a sickeningly proud smile and nodded his head. "We used tough love to make you strong, Naomi," he declared. "You owe your drive to me kicking you out. If I had let you stay in my house and enabled your teenage rebellion, you never would have built all of this." The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He was sitting at my table, eating my food in a house I paid for, and he was genuinely trying to spin his absolute abandonment as a masterclass in parenting. He wanted me to thank him for throwing me away. I did not scream. I did not slam my fists on the mahogany table. I did not throw my plate across the room. I simply reached forward, picked up my crystal goblet of sparkling water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold carbonation hit the back of my throat, grounding me in the present moment. But as I set the glass down, my mind instantly, violently flashed back to the reality of his so-called tough love. I remembered the rusted-out 1998 Honda Civic. It had a broken heater and a passenger window that would not roll up all the way. I remembered parking it under the flickering fluorescent lights of a 24-hour superstore just so I would feel a tiny fraction of safety. I remembered the biting, bitter Georgia cold seeping through the thin fleece blanket I had managed to buy from a thrift store. I was 18 years old and terrified. My body was changing and aching with the early stages of pregnancy. My back throbbed from sleeping, contorted across the uneven backseat of the car. I remembered the sheer, desperate hunger that gnawed at my stomach every single night. I ate nothing but dry, stale saltines and drank warm tap water from public restroom sinks because every single crumpled dollar bill I earned from waitressing had to be saved. I needed an apartment deposit. I needed a safe place to bring my son into the world. I needed to survive. That was the tough love Richard was demanding credit for. The nights I spent crying into a cheap pillow, absolutely convinced I was going to freeze to death before my baby was even born. The absolute terror of a police officer knocking on my window at 3 in the morning telling me I had to move along. He did not build my empire. My empire was built out of a desperate, ferocious need to ensure that his bloodline would never have the power to hurt my son the way they had hurt me. Brenda nodded, along with Richard's speech dabbing at the corners of her mouth with her napkin. "Your father is absolutely right, Naomi," she chimed in, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "It broke our hearts to close that door on you. It was the hardest thing a mother could ever do. But we knew you were slipping away from us. We had to push you out of the nest so you could learn how to fly. And look at the magnificent wings you grew. You should be immensely grateful for the foundation we gave you." Jasmine rolled her eyes, stabbing a scallop with her fork. "Well, do not praise her too much, Mom." Jasmine muttered, her voice thick with petty jealousy. She got lucky. The real estate market boomed right when she got her license. Some of us actually have real talent and just get stuck dealing with a bad economy. Andre is building something that will change the world. Naomi just flips buildings. I shifted my gaze to Jamal. He was sitting perfectly still, cutting his food with precise, measured movements. I had never hidden the truth from him. He knew exactly how we started. He knew about the Honda Civic and the saltines. He knew about the hospital forms I had to sign by myself. He looked up from his plate and locked eyes with Richard. The expression on my 16-year-old son's face was one of absolute cold, analytical disgust. It was the look you give a cockroach right before you step on it. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their self-serving lies to settle deep into the fabric of the room. I wanted them to feel comfortable. I wanted them to feel secure in their delusions. "You have a very interesting perspective on the past, Richard," I finally said, my voice smooth and completely devoid of emotion. "I suppose history is always written by the victors, or in this case, the survivors." Richard beamed, completely missing the lethal undertone of my words. "Exactly," he said, leaning forward and pointing a finger at me. "You survived because I gave you the grit to survive, which is exactly why I know you are going to do the right thing today. Your sister needs stability right now, and since you clearly have more money than you know what to do with, we can bypass all the dramatic arguments. I expect you to have the keys to that pool house ready for Jasmine and Andre by tomorrow morning. And frankly, Naomi, I think a modest check to help get Andre's business off the ground is the least you can do to repay us for setting you on this path to greatness." He was demanding a bailout, wrapped in the guise of a parental tax. The greed was so thick it was practically choking the life out of the room. I looked at the four of them, realizing just how deeply diseased their minds truly were. They were not here to reconcile. They were parasites looking for a new host. I smiled. It was not a happy expression, but a sharp, dangerous baring of teeth. "Is that what you think this is, Richard?" I asked softly. "You think this dinner is a negotiation?" Before he could answer, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from my lead corporate attorney. The trap was ready. All I had to do was spring it. I slid my phone back into my pocket without breaking eye contact with Richard. The notification from my attorney was the silent green light I had been waiting for, but I was not quite ready to end the show just yet. There was still too much entertainment value in watching them scramble and dig their graves deeper into the dirt. Jasmine slammed her silver fork down onto her fine china plate, the sharp clatter echoing loudly across the dining room. She simply could not hold it in anymore. The sheer magnitude of my wealth, the private chef, the marble floors, and the reality that she was currently facing eviction while I lived in a fortress of luxury was eating her alive from the inside out. "Let us be real for a second here, Naomi," she sneered, picking up her crystal wine glass and swirling the expensive vintage around with aggressive, jerky movements. "You are sitting at the head of this table, acting like some brilliant corporate mastermind, but we all know real estate is just lucky money. You bought a few cheap lots when the market bottomed out and rode the gentrification wave. It does not take actual intellect or hard work to do what you do. It just takes being in the right place at the right time. Anybody with a basic loan could have flipped those properties." Andre eagerly seized the opening his wife had just created. He sat up straighter, adjusting the collar of his shirt and trying to project the aura of a seasoned Silicon Valley CEO. "Exactly," he said, pointing a finger at me as if delivering a profound business lecture. "Jasmine is spot on. Physical assets are a dying dinosaur, Naomi. The real wealth, the generational wealth, is in disruptive technology. My platform is a decentralized software as a service model designed to completely revolutionize urban supply chain logistics. We are talking about leveraging algorithmic synergy to eliminate middleman bloat and optimize the delivery matrix. It was a spectacular word salad of entirely meaningless tech jargon. He had just strung together a bunch of empty buzzwords he had probably memorized from a podcast. I knew for an absolute fact his so-called revolutionary platform was nothing more than a glitchy, poorly coded delivery app that had already been sued twice for unpaid vendor invoices. But I did not interrupt him. I sat back and let him talk. The problem with true innovation is that visionary thinkers often outpace their initial seed capital. Andre continued shaking his head with a manufactured and heavy sigh. My angel investors simply lacked the foresight to weather a temporary pivot in our development phase. They pulled out because they did not understand the long-term scalability of my vision. That is why Jasmine and I are currently restructuring our liquid assets. It is a strategic retreat, not a financial failure. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows aggressively on the polished mahogany table. Which brings us to why we are really here, she said, her tone shifting from dismissive jealousy to outright demanding. Andre is sitting on $1 billion idea. He just needs a bridge loan to get through the final beta testing and launch the product. We need $50,000, Naomi. And we need the funds cleared in our account by tomorrow morning, so we can secure our new commercial office space and cover the deposit on a temporary luxury rental, $50,000. She said it with the casual, effortless ease of asking me to pass the salt across the table. I looked at her perfectly manicured nails, the expensive designer necklace resting against her collarbone, and the sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from every pore of her body. You are asking me to write you a $50,000 check to fund a failing app, I clarified, keeping my voice dangerously level and quiet. I am not asking you. Jasmine snapped, her eyes flashing with indignant fury. I am telling you. Quite frankly, you owe us this money, Naomi. Do you have any idea how much stress you put this entire family through when you were a teenager? Do you know the absolute humiliation Mom and Dad suffered when you got knocked up and refused to just take care of the problem like they asked you to? At the mention of him being a problem that should have been taken care of, I saw Jamal physically react. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles ticked in his cheek, and his knuckles turned completely white where he gripped his water glass. He was brilliant and incredibly mature, but he was still a 16-year-old boy, listening to his aunt casually discuss how his existence had been a tragic burden. I reached under the table and placed my hand gently on his knee, giving it a firm, reassuring squeeze. He looked at me, his eyes dark, with a quiet, simmering anger. I gave him a microscopic shake of my head. Not yet. Let them finish hanging themselves. I had to go to high school every single day and deal with the whispers and the stares from my friends. Jasmine continued, her voice rising in pitch as she played the ultimate victim. You ruined my senior year with your disgusting, selfish drama. You dragged our family name through the mud. Brenda nodded sympathetically, reaching out to pat Jasmine on the hand. It was a very dark and painful time for all of us, she agreed softly, looking at me with absolute reproach. Your sister sacrificed a lot of her own peace of mind to help keep this family together while you were out running the streets and making terrible choices. We all suffered because of you, Naomi. So yes, I think a $50,000 check is the absolute bare minimum you can do, Jasmine concluded, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Consider it back pay for the guidance and the tough love you just admitted gave you this exact lifestyle. You have millions of dollars tied up in this ridiculous oversized property. 50 grand is absolute pocket change to you. It is time you finally paid your fair share, wiped the slate clean, and acted like a real member of this family. I turned my attention back to my sister. Her face was flushed with the exertion of her own monumental delusion. She genuinely believed her twisted, broken logic. In her mind, I was a delinquent who had simply stumbled backward into a fortune, and she was the rightful princess demanding her long-overdue tax. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch until the tension in the dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The heavy silence that followed Jasmine's demand for $50,000 was thick enough to suffocate a person. I simply sat there at the head of the table, letting the sheer absurdity of her extortion attempt ring in the ears of everyone present. Andre, realizing that his wife had perhaps played their hand entirely too aggressively, decided he needed to shift the spotlight. He cleared his throat, adjusting his posture, and turned his attention away from me. He locked his eyes on my 16-year-old son Jamal, sitting quietly to my right. Andre put on a sickeningly fake smile, adopting the tone of a wise and worldly mentor speaking to a troubled youth. "So Jamal," Andre said, picking up his crystal water glass and swirling it around. "A big empty house like this must have a lot of distractions. Are you managing to stay out of trouble out here in the suburbs? High school can be a tricky time for a young man, especially when he does not have a strong male role model around to guide him." The dig was intentional and completely transparent. Andre was trying to subtly insult my status as a single mother while simultaneously elevating himself as the alpha male of the room. He wanted to make Jamal feel small to regain the upper hand they were so rapidly losing. I did not intervene. I did not need to. I had raised a king, and I knew exactly how he handled peasants. Jamal calmly placed his heavy silver fork down on his porcelain plate. He picked up his linen napkin and casually dabbed the corners of his mouth. He turned his head and looked directly at Andre with eyes that were terrifyingly cold and analytical. It was the exact same look I used right before dismantling a hostile corporate takeover. "I am doing just fine, Andre," my son replied, his voice smooth and incredibly steady. "My daily schedule does not really leave much room for teenage trouble." Andre chuckled, a patronizing and dismissive sound. "Right, of course," Andre said, waving a hand in the air. "Video games and hanging out at the mall take up a lot of time. Just enjoy it while it lasts, kid. The real world hits hard and fast." "Are you thinking about applying to community college? Or are you just going to go straight into the workforce after graduation?" Jamal tilted his head slightly, observing Andre as if he were a fascinating biological specimen under a microscope. "Actually, I received an early admission letter from Columbia University last month," Jamal stated clearly. "I will be entering their applied physics and engineering program a full year early." The condescending smirk on Andre's face instantly froze. The hand holding his water glass stopped moving mid-air. Jamal did not stop there. He leaned forward just a fraction, twisting the knife with absolute precision. "And regarding the real world, I am currently finalizing the licensing rights for a predictive machine learning algorithm I patented last fall. It optimizes server load distribution for cloud-based applications. In fact, if your logistics platform ever actually makes it past the beta phase, and you manage to secure actual funding, you might end up leasing my architecture to keep your servers from crashing." The dining room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the low hum of the climate control system and the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Andre looked like he had just been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He had just tried to patronize a 16-year-old boy and was systematically verbally dismantled by a certified prodigy. Jasmine sat completely paralyzed, her face drained of all color, staring at my son as if he had just grown a second head. Richard and Brenda were completely motionless. I watched the gears violently grinding inside my mother's head. For 17 years, she had justified throwing me out by claiming my baby would ruin my life. Now she was staring at a teenager heading to an Ivy League university with a software patent to his name. But Brenda did not feel shame. She felt greed. She saw dollar signs flashing brightly above Jamal's head. He was not just the heir to my real estate empire anymore. He was a gold mine all on his own. Brenda leaned forward over the mahogany table, her eyes wide and dripping with a sudden, fabricated adoration. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, clasping her hands together. "Columbia University, a software patent. Richard, do you hear this? Our grandson is an absolute genius." She turned her manicured hands toward Jamal, gesturing broadly. "You know, Jamal, it is an absolute tragedy that we have missed out on so much of your life. Family is everything. A brilliant young man like yourself needs to be closely connected to his roots. You should come live with us for the summer. We have a wonderful spare room, and your grandfather could teach you so much about business and being a strong man. It would be such a beautiful bonding experience for all of us. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her proposal hit me like a physical shockwave. They were currently facing eviction. They had just arrived at my gate unannounced, begging to live in my guest house because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. They were demanding $50,000 just to keep themselves afloat. And yet here my mother was offering my son a non-existent spare room in a desperate bid to sink her claws into his future earnings. I could not hold it in. The absurdity of the situation bubbled up from deep inside my chest and exploded. I threw my head back and laughed out loud. It was not a polite chuckle or a soft giggle. It was a full, rich, booming laugh that echoed off the 30-foot ceilings of the dining room. I laughed at their delusion. I laughed at their absolute lack of self-awareness. Brenda's face instantly flushed a dark, angry red. "What is so funny, Naomi?" She snapped, her fake sweet tone vanishing entirely. "I am trying to build a bridge here and welcome your son into this family. You are trying to build a bridge straight to his bank account, Brenda," I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. "You do not even have a house for yourselves, let alone a spare bedroom for my son." The truth of my words hit Richard like a whip. The humiliation of being exposed, the reality of his favorite daughter being denied, the embarrassment of Andre being schooled by a teenager, and now the sting of his wife being openly mocked by the daughter he threw away, was simply too much for his fragile, toxic ego to handle. "You listen to me, you disrespectful little brat!" Richard roared, his voice thundering through the room. He stood up so violently that his heavy leather dining chair screeched backward across the imported marble floor. His face was a dangerous shade of purple as he raised his fist high in the air. He slammed it down onto the solid mahogany table with bone-rattling force. The crystal water goblets and expensive wine glasses shook violently, sloshing their contents onto the pristine white tablecloth. But Richard's dramatic display of dominance came with an immediate and severe physical cost. The violent, jerky motion of his arms slamming against the table dislodged something from the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. A thick, folded piece of heavy paper slipped out of his pocket. It tumbled silently through the air before landing flat on the polished marble floor, right next to the toe of his designer leather shoes. Richard was completely oblivious to what had just happened. He was too busy glaring down at me, panting heavily with his chest heaving in manufactured outrage, waiting for me to cower in fear just like I used to when I was a child. But I did not look at his angry face. My eyes had instantly dropped to the floor, tracking the movement of the falling document. The paper was folded in thirds, but it had landed face up, perfectly illuminated by the modern dining room chandelier. At the very top of the page, stamped in bold, unmistakable red ink, was a single word: foreclosure. My breath hitched in my throat as my eyes locked onto the document. The final puzzle piece had just fallen right into my lap. Richard was still breathless from his outburst, his chest heaving as he glared at me from across the mahogany table. He was so completely consumed by his own manufactured rage that he had no idea he had just dropped the key to his own destruction right at my feet. I did not break eye contact with him. I simply shifted my weight slightly and smoothly slid the toe of my leather pump over the folded document, hiding it completely from view. I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. I did not yell. I did not match his chaotic, unhinged energy. I operated on a frequency he could not even begin to comprehend. "This dinner is over," I announced, my voice echoing coldly in the large room. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. "You came to my home uninvited," I continued. "You insulted my son. You demanded my property. And you attempted to extort me for $50,000. You have overstayed your welcome by exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. I pressed a small silver button hidden beneath the lip of the dining table. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy dining room doors opened, and David, my head of security, stepped inside, accompanied by another tall, broad-shouldered guard. "David, please escort my guests to their vehicle," I said, gesturing toward my family. "They were just leaving, and make sure they do not take any detours on their way down the driveway." The sudden appearance of armed security completely shattered whatever remaining bravado Richard possessed. He looked at the two large men and then back at me, his face pale and sweating. Jasmine immediately grabbed Andres' arm, her eyes wide with panic. Brenda let out a dramatic wounded gasp, clutching her pearls as if I had just committed a violent crime against her. "You cannot be serious, Naomi," Brenda cried out, her voice trembling. "You are throwing your own mother out into the night. I am showing you the door, Brenda," I corrected sharply, which is vastly superior to throwing a pregnant teenager onto a concrete porch in the freezing rain. "Have a safe drive back to whatever eviction notice you are currently running from." David took a step forward, clearing his throat. "Right this way, folks," he said, his tone polite but leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. They scrambled. The sheer embarrassment of being physically escorted out by security guards stripped them of any lingering dignity. Andre practically dragged Jasmine out of the room, while Richard and Brenda followed close behind, muttering under their breath. I stood perfectly still, listening to the sharp click of my front doors closing and the heavy mechanical hum of the deadbolts locking into place. The house fell completely silent. Jamal stood up from his chair. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, his voice quiet and steady. "I am perfectly fine, baby." I smiled, turning to him. "Go upstairs and finish your homework. I have some business to take care of tonight." Once Jamal was safely headed upstairs to his wing of the house, I stepped back and looked down at the marble floor. I moved my foot and picked up the folded piece of heavy paper Richard had dropped. I smoothed it out under the bright dining room lights. It was a formal legal notice from a prominent Atlanta bank, notice of default and intent to foreclose. It listed my parents' primary residence, their massive 5-bedroom house in an affluent suburb. They were over 90 days past due on a massive balloon payment. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. They were not just struggling, they were drowning. I walked straight up the sweeping staircase and into my home office. I bypassed the main lights, opting instead for the soft glow of my desk lamp and the cool blue light of my multi-monitor workstation. I sat down in my leather chair and pulled up my encrypted communications network. Operating a high-level luxury real estate firm meant I had a massive network of industry contacts, financial analysts, and private investigators on speed dial. I did not need to wait until morning to get answers. I picked up my phone and dialed Kendrick, my lead financial analyst and one of the sharpest forensic accountants in the state of Georgia. He answered on the second ring, despite it being nearly midnight. "Kendrick, I need a favor," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I need a complete financial autopsy on a company called Apex Builders run by Richard. I also need you to run a deep background check on his personal assets and any shell companies tied to his wife Brenda or a man named Andre. Pull everything. Mortgages, credit histories, outstanding liens. I want to know exactly how deep the water is." "Give me an hour," Kendrick replied, typing rapidly in the background. "I will send the encrypted files directly to your private server." For the next 60 minutes, I sat in the quiet of my office, sipping a cup of black coffee and organizing my thoughts. The puzzle pieces were rapidly locking into place. Jasmine and Andre getting evicted was only a symptom of the disease. The real rot was at the head of the family. My computer chimed with a secure incoming file transfer. I opened the encrypted folder Kendrick had just sent over and began reading through the financial disclosures. It was worse than I could have possibly imagined. It was an absolute bloodbath of financial incompetence and unchecked vanity. According to the records, Richard's construction business, Apex Builders, had not just hit a rough patch. It had completely collapsed. He had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 2 full years ago after severely mismanaging a series of commercial contracts. His business accounts were completely drained. Yet for the past 2 years, Richard and Brenda had continued to live like royalty. They kept their expensive country club memberships. They leased brand new luxury vehicles every 12 months. Brenda continued to host lavish high society brunches and buy designer clothes. They had been desperately trying to maintain their wealthy facade within their elite social circle, terrified of the humiliation that would come if anyone found out they were actually broke. To fund this delusion, they had maxed out over a dozen high-limit credit cards. But that was not the worst part. When the credit dried up, Richard had taken out a massive predatory hard money loan against the remaining equity of their home. He had borrowed cash at a toxic, exorbitant interest rate from a shadowy lending group known for seizing assets the absolute second a payment was missed. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the exact figures of the loan. The numbers perfectly explained the bizarre events of the evening. The $50,000 Jasmine had so aggressively demanded at the dinner table was not seed money for Andre's fake tech startup. Andre was just the convenient scapegoat. That $50,000 was the exact amount of the past due balloon payment Richard owed the predatory lenders to temporarily stall the foreclosure on his house. They had come to my estate tonight intending to use Jasmine as a Trojan horse to extract the funds they desperately needed to save their own skin. They were completely out of options. They had burned through their cash, their credit, and their home equity. They were standing on the edge of a sheer financial cliff, and gravity was already pulling them down. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet office. The irony was almost suffocating. The man who had thrown me out into the cold because he claimed I would drain his resources was now a financial ghost haunting a house he no longer owned. But as I scrolled further down into the depths of Kendrick's forensic report, a second file caught my eye. It was flagged in bright red with a note attached from Kendrick that simply read, "You need to look at this right now." I clicked the file open. It was a scanned copy of a secondary loan agreement finalized 5 years ago. I scanned the terms, the exorbitant interest rates, and the borrowing history. And then my eyes drifted down to the guarantor signature line at the bottom of the last page. My heart completely stopped. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and a sudden blinding rage. There, scrawled across the bottom of the legally binding document, was my signature, my full legal name, my old social security number, all used to guarantee a massive high-risk loan, but I had never signed it. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting off my irises. The digital ink of the signature was a perfect imitation of the way I used to write my name when I was 18. The loops, the slant, and the pressure points were all meticulously copied from some old high school permission slip or medical form he had kept tucked away in a filing cabinet. But the date on the document was only 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I was already building NW Holdings. 5 years ago, I was a complete ghost to them. Yet Richard had taken my old social security number, the one I had before I legally emancipated myself and secured a new tax identification matrix for my corporate entities, and used it to secure a secondary line of credit. I scrolled down to the digital footprint section of the loan origination file. Modern forensic accounting leaves absolutely nothing to the imagination. Kendrick had highlighted the IP address used to finalize the digital authorization. I cross-referenced the geographic location on my second monitor. It traced back to an apartment complex in downtown Atlanta. It was the exact same luxury condo building Jasmine and Andre were currently being evicted from. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Richard did not have the technical literacy to bypass the dual-factor authentication required for a loan of this magnitude. He was an old-school contractor who barely knew how to operate his email. But Andre did. Andre, with his failing software ventures and his desperate need for his father-in-law's approval, had helped Richard orchestrate the identity theft. They had colluded to forge my digital signature. They had worked together to chain my financial identity to their sinking ship. The betrayal was so profound and so fundamentally evil that it transcended normal human emotion. I did not cry. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. The rage that filled my chest was not hot or explosive. It was absolute freezing ice. It crystallized in my veins, sharpening my focus to a razor edge. Richard had not merely kicked a pregnant teenager out into the street. He had waited until that teenager survived, clawed her way to success, and then he reached out from the shadows to secretly strap a concrete anchor to her ankle. He fully intended to let me drown right alongside him when his house of cards inevitably collapsed. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney, Elias. He answered immediately, the sound of rustling papers in the background indicating he was already reviewing the encrypted files Kendrick had forwarded to his secure portal. "Tell me you are looking at page 42? I said, my voice completely stripped of any inflection. "I am looking at it," Elias replied, his tone grim and entirely professional. "It is textbook wire fraud and felony identity theft, Naomi. If this hard money lender calls in the loan and realizes Richard is completely insolvent, they are going to come directly after you as the primary guarantor. They will attempt to place a massive lien on your personal assets. We need to go to the federal authorities immediately. We have the IP addresses, the forged digital certificates, and the financial trail. Richard and his son-in-law are looking at serious federal prison time." "No," I replied softly, my eyes never leaving the forged signature on my monitor. "Not yet, Elias. If we bring in the authorities right now, it becomes a slow, bureaucratic process. Richard will hire a cheap defense attorney, he will play the victim, and he will drag my name through a public courtroom. He will try to spin a sob story narrative claiming that I authorized this transaction to help my struggling family, and then backed out at the last minute to ruin him. I am not giving him the luxury of a courtroom stage. I am not giving him the opportunity to paint himself as a martyr. I am going to handle this in the boardroom." "What exactly are you proposing?" Naomi Elias asked, a hint of cautious respect in his voice. He knew how I operated when a competitor tried to undercut my firm. Now he was about to see how I handled a parasite. "I want you to contact this predatory lending group first thing tomorrow morning," I instructed. "Reach out through our Shadow LLC. Do not use the NW Holdings banner. I want to buy Richard's debt, all of it. The primary mortgage, the secondary loan, the credit card charge-offs. I want to hold every single piece of paper that dictates his financial existence. Offer them a 10% premium on the principal for an expedited quiet transfer of the entire debt portfolio. They are loan sharks, Elias. They want liquid cash, not a messy foreclosure battle with a high-powered legal team. Buy the debt." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. "You are talking about millions of dollars, Naomi, in completely toxic assets. You are essentially bailing him out of his immediate crisis just to own the rights to his destruction." "Exactly," I said, leaning back in my leather chair and watching the city lights twinkle through my office window. "He thinks he owes money to a faceless, aggressive corporation. He thinks he can manipulate the system and hide behind my forged signature. By the time he realizes I am the bank, the trap will be completely sealed around his neck. Draw up the acquisition paperwork, Elias. Have it ready for my signature by 9 tomorrow morning." "Understood," Elias said, the grim satisfaction clear in his voice. "I will start making the calls at dawn." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the polished wood of my desk. The exhaustion of the day should have been weighing me down, but I had never felt more awake. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling estate that Richard had mockingly claimed I was just managing. He had come to my gates demanding respect, demanding money, and demanding housing, completely unaware that he had just handed me the executioner's axe. I opened my personal calendar on my tablet. Tomorrow was Saturday. Brenda was scheduled to host her monthly high society brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was an exclusive invitation-only event where the elite women of Atlanta gathered to drink expensive mimosas, compare designer handbags, and brag about their perfectly curated families. It was Brenda's absolute favorite stage, the place where she maintained the grand illusion of her wealth and unparalleled social standing. She had been dodging the club's membership dues for 6 months, but she still paraded around the dining room acting like modern royalty. She loved to brag to her wealthy friends about her successful CEO daughter, leaving out the part where she had abandoned that same daughter in a parking lot. I closed my tablet and turned off the desk lamp, plunging the office into darkness. I knew exactly where I needed to be tomorrow morning. It was time to crash the party and burn the facade to the ground. The Saturday morning sun was bright and unforgiving as my driver pulled the Tesla up to the grand entrance of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was an exclusive sprawling property in the affluent northern suburbs of Atlanta, known for its immaculate golf courses and astronomical membership fees. I stepped out of the car wearing a pristine white tailored power suit and oversized designer sunglasses. I handed the keys to the valet and walked through the heavy glass doors. The air inside smelled of expensive floral arrangements and old money. I knew for an absolute fact from Kendrick's forensic accounting report that Richard and Brenda were currently 6 months behind on their membership dues. They were on the verge of having their names publicly posted on the club notice board for delinquent accounts. Yet here they were, spending their Saturday mornings sipping overpriced champagne and pretending they owned the world. I walked past the concierge desk and made my way toward the outdoor garden patio where the high society brunch was being held. I did not need an invitation. My presence commanded the room the moment I stepped onto the terrace. I spotted them immediately. Brenda was holding court at a large circular table shaded by a massive white umbrella. She was wearing a brightly colored silk dress and leaning forward, waving her manicured hands as she spoke to a captive audience of 5 wealthy older women. Richard sat beside her, nursing a glass of scotch and nodding along, looking like the proud patriarch of a thriving dynasty. I walked slowly, stepping quietly across the stone patio so I could hear exactly what fiction my mother was spinning. "Oh, it is just exhausting keeping up with her," Brenda sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. "My Naomi is just so incredibly busy. She closed another multi-million-dollar commercial acquisition just yesterday. She actually begged us to move into one of the guest houses on her new estate, just so she could see us more often. But Richard and I value our independence too much. We simply cannot let her coddle us, no matter how much she wants to." The women at the table murmured in impressed agreement, sipping their mimosas. "She has always been my greatest achievement," Brenda continued, her voice dripping with manufactured maternal pride. "I always pushed her to be fiercely independent. And look at the empire she built." I stopped right behind Brenda's chair. I took off my sunglasses and offered a brilliant, razor-sharp smile to the women sitting across the table. Their eyes widened in surprise as they recognized my face from the local business magazine profiles Brenda loved to carry around in her purse. "I do not recall begging you to move in, Brenda," I said. My voice was smooth and perfectly pitched, carrying just enough volume to silence the entire table. Brenda froze. Her shoulders instantly went rigid, and the fake smile plastered on her face completely shattered. She turned around slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and rising panic. Richard nearly choked on his scotch, coughing into his napkin as he stared at me. Naomi, Brenda stammered, her voice jumping a full octave. "What a wonderful surprise, darling. We did not expect you to join us today." I looked at the wealthy women staring at us with polite curiosity. "Good morning, ladies," I said, offering them a gracious nod. "I apologize for the interruption, but my parents and I have a very urgent family matter to discuss regarding their financial portfolio." I placed a firm hand on the back of Brenda's chair and looked directly at Richard. "We are going to the private reading lounge," I instructed, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Right now." Brenda tried to laugh it off, patting my hand with trembling fingers. "Oh, sweetheart, can this not wait? We are right in the middle of brunch." I leaned down so only she and Richard could hear me. "You can either stand up and walk to the lounge quietly, or I can loudly ask the club manager to explain why your membership dues have been bouncing for the last 6 months. The choice is entirely yours." Richard slammed his glass down on the table. He stood up abruptly, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He grabbed Brenda's arm and pulled her out of her chair, offering the table of women a a tight, strained smile, before marching toward the glass doors leading back into the clubhouse. I followed closely behind them, directing them down a quiet, carpeted hallway and into a secluded, mahogany-paneled reading room. I closed the heavy oak door behind us, shutting out the noise of the country club. The room was soundproof and completely empty. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard hissed, rounding on me the second the door clicked shut. "You do not ever disrespect us in front of our friends. You have no idea how social politics work in a place like this." I did not say a word. I simply opened my designer handbag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and tossed it onto the center of the mahogany coffee table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "Open it," I commanded. Richard glared at me, but his curiosity won out. He snatched the folder from the table and flipped it open. Brenda peered over his shoulder. I watched their eyes scan the first page. It was a printed copy of the forensic accounting report Kendrick had compiled. It showed their bankruptcies, their maxed-out credit cards, and the impending foreclosure on their home. But that was just the appetizer. "Turn to page 4, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. Richard flipped the pages, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. He stopped on the copy of the secondary loan agreement. His eyes darted straight to the bottom of the page, locking onto the forged signature. The color drained from his face completely. The arrogant, blustering patriarch vanished, replaced instantly by a cornered, desperate animal. Brenda let out a sharp, terrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. "Richard, what did you do?" "He did exactly what he does best," I answered, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "He used people. You forged my signature, Richard. You colluded with Andre to bypass digital security protocols, and you illegally bound my social security number to a predatory loan. You committed felony wire fraud and identity theft to fund your country club lifestyle." Richard swallowed hard, stepping back until his legs hit the edge of a leather armchair. He gripped the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. But the apology I was waiting for never came. Instead, the absolute depths of his narcissistic delusion took over. He straightened his spine and jutted his chin out defensively. "It is family," he barked, attempting to go on the offensive. "You have plenty of money, Naomi. You throw around millions of dollars like it is nothing. This loan is a drop in the bucket for your holding company. I needed liquidity to keep our business afloat. You should be honored that your credit was strong enough to help your father when he needed it." I stared at him, truly marveling at the sheer psychological gymnastics happening in his brain. "Honored," I repeated flatly. "You stole my identity, and you expect me to be honored. Do not act like a victim," Richard sneered, stepping forward and pointing a finger at my chest. "I raised you. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I fed you. You owe me a return on my investment. All you have to do is call these lenders and pay off the balance. If you do not, we lose the house. We lose everything." "And why exactly is that my problem?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because if I go down, I am taking you with me." Richard threatened, his voice dripping with venom. "You think your pristine corporate reputation can handle a massive public scandal? If you let me go to prison or lose my home, I will call every news outlet in Atlanta. I will tell the press that the great self-made CEO Naomi abandoned her destitute parents. I will tell them you are a ruthless, heartless sociopath who watched her family starve while you lived in a mansion. Let us see how your high-end commercial clients feel about doing business with a monster." He was actually trying to blackmail me. He had stolen my identity, bound me to a predatory loan, and was now threatening to launch a public relations smear campaign if I did not bail him out of the financial grave he had dug for himself. He truly believed he had backed me into a corner. He thought my reputation was my weak point. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold, mechanical precision of a predator realizing its prey had just willingly walked into a cage and locked the door from the inside. I let the silence stretch in the mahogany reading room. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance. He really thought his threat of a public smear campaign had cornered me. I looked down at the floor, deliberately letting my shoulders slump. I needed him to believe he still held the power. I needed him to feel absolutely invincible so the fall would break him completely. "Fine," I said, letting my voice waver just a fraction of an inch to sell the performance. "You win, Richard." The immediate shift in his posture was almost comical. The panicked, cornered animal vanished instantly, replaced by the arrogant patriarch who believed he was the smartest man in the room. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket and let out a loud, patronizing sigh. "I knew you would see reason," Naomi Richards said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "You have built a very impressive reputation for yourself. It would be a tragedy to see it ruined over a simple family misunderstanding. We will just get this little loan cleared up and put it all behind us." Brenda placed a hand on her chest, letting out a dramatic breath of relief. "Oh, thank goodness," she chimed in, stepping forward to pat my arm. I suppressed the physical urge to pull away from her touch. "I always knew you had a good heart, Naomi. Deep down, you know how much we sacrificed for you. This is just your way of giving back to the family." "I am not writing you a blank check," I said, looking back up at Richard with a carefully crafted expression of reluctant defeat. "I am not transferring millions of dollars into your personal bank account. If I am going to pay off this debt, I am doing it strictly by the book. You need to arrange a formal meeting with your creditors. Bring them to my corporate office downtown this coming Tuesday at 10 in the morning. My legal team will review the remaining balance, and I will authorize the payoff directly to the lending group." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "That is perfectly fine. The lenders are a private equity group. They just want their cash. I will make the calls and have their representatives meet us at your office. See Brenda. I told you she would handle it." I turned around and picked up my designer handbag from the leather chair. "Tuesday at 10. Richard, do not be late." I walked out of the reading room without waiting for a response, leaving them in the country club they could no longer afford. The news of my apparent submission must have traveled through the family pipeline at lightning speed. By the time my driver navigated the Tesla back onto the main highway, my phone was already vibrating relentlessly in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The notifications were rolling in one after another from my sister Jasmine and her husband Andre. They had clearly interpreted my agreement to pay off Richard's loan as a complete surrender to the family hierarchy. In their twisted minds, I had finally been broken, and my bank accounts were now open for their personal rating. Jasmine sent me a link to a luxury real estate listing. It was a sprawling 6-bedroom modern farmhouse in the exclusive Buckhead neighborhood, listed for $2.4 million. A second text immediately followed. "Andre and I toured this property last week. It has the perfect square footage for his home office and a beautiful nursery for when we decide to have kids. Since you are clearing Dad's debt, we need you to wire the 20% down payment to our escrow account by Wednesday. The seller has multiple offers, so do not drag your feet on this, Naomi." I stared at the glowing screen, genuinely amazed by the sheer limitless boundaries of her audacity. She was actively facing eviction, yet she was casually demanding a $500,000 wire transfer via text message as if she were ordering takeout. A moment later, another message popped up, this time from Andre. "Glad to see you are finally stepping up and acting like a team player, Naomi. Jasmine told me about the Buckhead house. Also, I forwarded you the pitch deck for my software launch. I am putting you down for a $75,000 angel investment. Consider it a family discount on the equity. See you Tuesday." I did not block their numbers. I did not respond with anger. I simply typed a single identical reply to both of them. "We will finalize all family financial distributions at the meeting on Tuesday." I locked my phone and rested my head against the cool leather seat of the car. Let them dream. Let them pick out curtains for a mansion they would never step foot inside. Let them spend the entire weekend floating on a cloud of unearned victory. The higher they climbed, the more devastating the impact would be when they finally hit the ground. 3 days later, the morning sun was casting long golden shadows across the polished glass and steel of my downtown corporate headquarters. I was sitting at the massive mahogany desk in my corner office on the 40th floor. The Atlanta skyline stretched out behind me, a sprawling testament to power and ambition. My lead corporate attorney, Elias, walked through the double doors of my office carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression deadly serious. He set the briefcase on my desk, clicked the brass locks open, and pulled out a massive stack of heavily vetted legal documents. "The acquisition is completely finalized," Elias said, sliding the thick stack of papers across the polished wood toward me. "Our Shadow LLC successfully purchased the entirety of Richard's debt portfolio from the hard money lenders. We paid the 10% premium you authorized to expedite the transfer. We now hold the primary mortgage on his house, the secondary fraudulent loan, and all of his outstanding credit judgments." I picked up my gold-plated fountain pen and removed the cap. The metal was cool and heavy in my hand. Elias leaned forward, placing his hands flat on my desk. "Naomi, I need you to understand the absolute finality of what you are about to do. I have drafted the immediate notice of foreclosure and the eviction mandate. I have also prepared the formal criminal referral for the federal authorities regarding the forged signature and wire fraud. Once you sign these papers, there is no going back. It is a complete financial execution. They will be left with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the documents. I saw the names of the people who had ridiculed me, neglected me, and thrown me out to freeze. I saw the man who called my brilliant son a mistake. I saw the mother who watched it happen and the sister who cheered them on. I pressed the gold nib of the pen against the signature line. "They lost me 17 years ago, Elias." I replied, my voice as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. "This is just the receipt." It was exactly 10 in the morning on Tuesday when the private elevator chimed on the 40th floor of the NW Holdings corporate tower. I was standing behind my mahogany desk watching the live security feed on my secondary monitor. The heavy stainless steel elevator doors slid open and my family stepped into the grand reception area of my company. They did not walk in looking like people facing imminent financial ruin. They strutted into the lobby looking as though they were arriving at a coronation. Richard led the pack wearing a tailored navy pinstripe suit and a silk tie. I knew from Kendrick's forensic report that the suit had been purchased on a high-interest department store credit card that was currently 120 days past due. Brenda was walking right beside him, draped in a bright floral designer dress and carrying a leather handbag that cost more than their remaining checking account balance. Jasmine and Andre trailed closely behind them, both dressed to the nines, projecting an absolute illusion of wealth and success. I watched through the high-definition camera as my executive assistant approached them with a warm, professional smile to welcome them to the office. Richard did not even bother to look her in the eye. He simply raised his hand and waved her off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "We are family," Richard announced, his voice booming through the quiet elegance of the lobby. "Just point us to the biggest conference room you have and tell Naomi we are ready for her. And get me a black coffee. Make it quick." He actually snapped his fingers at her. The sharp sound echoed through the reception area. My assistant, a highly educated professional who managed a multi-million-dollar schedule, simply blinked in mild surprise before maintaining her flawless composure. She politely directed them down the main hallway toward the executive boardroom. I switched the camera feed to the boardroom monitor. The executive conference room was the crown jewel of my office suite. It featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. In the center of the room sat a massive custom-built polished marble conference table, surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather chairs. Richard walked into the room and immediately gravitated toward the head of the table. He pulled out the primary executive chair, the seat reserved specifically for me, and dropped into it with a heavy sigh of satisfaction. He leaned back, laced his fingers behind his head, and shamelessly propped his expensive leather shoes right on top of the pristine marble table. He was actively marking his territory, acting as though he had just conquered the entire skyscraper. Brenda took a seat next to him, running her hands over the smooth leather of the chair and nodding approvingly at the sweeping city views. She looked completely in her element, entirely ignorant of the fact that she was sitting in a building paid for by the daughter she had thrown into the street. Jasmine did not even sit down. She immediately pulled out her phone and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She started posing and taking endless selfies, adjusting her hair and making sure the luxury skyline was perfectly framed in the background. I could already imagine the fake inspirational caption she was drafting in her head about closing major business deals and the grind of corporate life. She was essentially playing pretend in my reality. Andre was busy putting on his own pathetic performance. He sat down near the middle of the table, flipped open a sleek silver laptop, and immediately pulled out his phone. He started pacing back and forth near the glass wall, speaking loudly into his phone about venture capital and aggressive seed funding algorithms. He was clearly putting on a show for anyone who might be walking past the boardroom, trying to project the image of a high-powered tech mogul instead of a man who was 3 days away from being formally evicted from his apartment. I stood in my office watching the four of them on the screen. The sheer audacity was absolutely breathtaking. They had come to my company expecting me to hand over millions of dollars to erase their debts and fund their delusions. They firmly believed that because we shared the same blood, I was obligated to act as their personal, endless ATM. They thought my success was simply a resource for them to mine. Elias, my lead corporate attorney, stood next to me watching the same security monitor. He held the thick leather portfolio containing the newly acquired debt papers and the federal fraud referrals. He shook his head slowly, a look of profound professional disgust washing over his face. I have dealt with hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and ruthless hedge fund managers, Elias said, his voice low and quiet. But I have never in my entire career seen this level of raw, unadulterated entitlement. They are sitting in your boardroom acting like they own the company while you hold the deed to their absolute ruin. Delusion is a very powerful drug, Elias, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the screen, and they have been overdosing on it for my entire life. They genuinely believe that when I walk into that room, I am going to hand Richard a certified bank check, apologize for being difficult, and thank him for the privilege of paying off his secret loans. My assistant tapped gently on the open door of my office. They are settled in the boardroom, Naomi, she said, keeping her tone perfectly neutral. Richard requested coffee, but I told him our catering staff was currently unavailable. Thank you, I said, offering her an appreciative nod. You handled them perfectly. Please hold all of my calls for the next hour and ensure that security is on standby near the elevator banks. Of course, she replied before stepping back and closing the door softly behind her. I turned away from the monitor and looked at Elias. The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken, and the parasites were sitting comfortably inside the cage, eagerly waiting for their meal. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer and took a deep, steadying breath. I felt absolutely no fear, no anxiety, and no hesitation. The scared, pregnant teenager who used to beg for their approval was completely dead and gone. Let us not keep my father waiting any longer, I said, gesturing toward the door. He has a very busy schedule of losing everything he owns today. I walked out of my office with Elias right beside me, my heels clicking a steady rhythmic march against the hardwood floors of the hallway. I approached the glass doors of the boardroom, watching as my family continued to laugh and boast, completely oblivious to the financial execution that was about to take place. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped inside, ready to tear their entire world apart. I pushed the heavy glass doors open and stepped inside. Elias followed closely behind me, carrying his thick leather briefcase. Two of my largest private security guards flanked the entrance, stepping inside and pulling the heavy glass doors shut with a solid, definitive thud. The sound echoed sharply in the massive boardroom. Richard did not immediately register the presence of the security detail. He was too busy staring at my hands, looking for a certified bank check or a leather corporate checkbook. When he saw that my hands were completely empty, his smug smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. "Well, Naomi," Richard said, sitting forward and dropping his expensive leather shoes from the polished marble table. "Let us get down to business. I have a tea time at the golf course at 2 o'clock, and I would like to get this paperwork squared away so I can leave." "Where are the representatives from the private equity group? I thought you were bringing them here to sign the payoff release forms." Brenda nodded along, adjusting her designer handbag on her lap, fully expecting a quick and easy financial transaction. Jasmine and Andre finally looked up from their cell phones, sensing a sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I did not answer him. I walked to the head of the massive marble table, but I did not sit down in my executive chair. I simply reached out and tapped a command on the sleek touchscreen control panel embedded in the surface of the table. The automated blackout blinds seamlessly descended over the floor to ceiling glass walls, plunging the boardroom into a cool, dim twilight. The massive high-definition projector lowered silently from the ceiling and illuminated the pristine white wall behind me with a crisp, bright light. I stepped to the side so my family had a perfect, unobstructed view of the screen. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice laced with heavy annoyance. "I did not come down here for a corporate presentation, Naomi. I came here for the payoff check. Stop playing games and hand over the money." I clicked a small presentation remote in my hand, and the very first slide appeared on the screen. It was a blown-up high-resolution scan of the federal bankruptcy filing for Apex Builders. There, in massive black letters, was his beloved company name alongside a devastating list of liquidated assets and unpaid commercial vendors. The room went completely still. Andre sat up straight, his jaw dropping as he stared at the screen. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to die instantly in his throat. "You see, Richard?" I began, my voice ringing with absolute cold authority in the dim room. "When you came to my home and demanded $50,000, you told a very interesting and creative story about a temporary cash flow issue. You told Jasmine and Andre that my money was going to fund a revolutionary software launch and secure a new luxury rental property for them. But forensic numbers do not lie." I clicked the remote again. The next slide displayed the exact terms of the predatory hard money loan he had taken out against the remaining equity of his primary residence. I used a red laser pointer to highlight the massive balloon payment that was currently 90 days past due. The exact amount of that critically past due payment was exactly $50,000. Jasmine whipped her head around and stared at her father. Her eyes were wide with sudden shock and deep betrayal. "What is she talking about, Dad?" Jasmine asked, her voice trembling in the quiet room. "You said your business was perfectly fine. You said you were just restructuring some minor assets. You told me the money from Naomi was going directly into our escrow account for the Buckhead house." Brenda looked completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the projection screen as the horrifying reality of their public exposure crashed down on top of her. The pristine illusion of wealth she had fought so fiercely to maintain was being broadcast in high definition right in front of her face. Richard stood up so quickly, his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floorboards. "Turn that screen off right now," he roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "This is highly private financial information. You have absolutely no right to look into my business affairs. I told you to bring the lenders here to pay them off. Where are they? Where is my damn check, Naomi?" I looked at him and smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that held absolutely no warmth and no mercy. I pressed the button on my remote one final time. The screen flashed and displayed a massive portfolio of legal transfer documents. At the top of the title page was the corporate logo for a shell company named Blackwood Financial. Right underneath that logo was a direct legal line linking Blackwood Financial as a wholly owned subsidiary of NW Holdings, WW, my company. I stepped forward, resting both of my hands flat on the cool marble table. "The lenders are not coming, Richard," I said softly, letting the words sink into his skin. I did not bring you to my corporate headquarters to hand you a giant bailout check. I did not pay off your debt. I bought your debt. My holding company aggressively acquired every single outstanding loan, every maxed out high-interest credit card, and every defaulted mortgage attached to your name. I paid a premium overhead fee to expedite the complete transfer of those toxic assets. I did not wipe your slate clean. I just became the bank. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Richard stared at the bright screen, his chest heaving rapidly as his mind violently attempted to process the sheer magnitude of what I had just said. I walked slowly around the edge of the marble table, closing the physical distance between us. Elias stood quietly by my side, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out the physical copies of the deeds and loan transfers, laying them out on the table one by one. I now hold the primary deed to your 5-bedroom house, I told him, my voice steady and rhythmic, listing off his entire life like a grocery receipt. I hold the titles to your leased luxury vehicles. I own the remaining physical collateral on your bankrupt construction firm. Every single penny you owe in this world you now owe directly to me. I am your sole legal creditor, Richard. I own you. Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound, burying her face in her manicured hands. The bright floral designer dress and the expensive leather handbag suddenly looked like cheap, pathetic props in a deeply tragic play. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that her elite social standing, her beautiful suburban home, and her entire existence were resting entirely in the palm of my hand. The daughter she had discarded like trash in a freezing parking lot was now the undisputed ruler of her world. Richard swayed heavily on his feet, visibly losing his physical balance as the crushing atmospheric weight of his new reality finally snapped his arrogant spine. He looked down at the physical deeds Elias had placed on the table, his eyes frantically scanning the undeniable legal proof of his own destruction. There was no escape. There was no bailout. He had walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse, and I was holding the blade. I pressed the button on my presentation remote one more time. The screen behind me shifted from the property deeds and mortgage transfers to a highly detailed forensic audit. The room was so quiet I could hear the steady hum of the projector cooling fan. I watched Richard slowly lift his head to look at the new slide. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. The document on the screen was the secondary loan agreement. It was blown up to massive proportions with a bright red circle, highlighting the guarantor's signature line at the bottom of the page. "You thought you were incredibly clever, Richard," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the boardroom. "You thought you could dig into a dusty filing cabinet, pull out my old medical records, and steal my original social security number. You legally bound my financial identity to a predatory loan, hoping you could use my pristine credit score to keep your sinking ship afloat for just a few more months." Richard opened his mouth, but his voice was completely gone. He looked like a man standing on the gallows, watching the trapdoor lever being pulled. "But you are a construction worker, Richard." I continued, pacing slowly along the edge of the marble table. "You barely know how to attach a file to an email. Bypassing modern digital authorization protocols and dual-factor authentication requires a specific level of technical literacy. You could never have committed this level of wire fraud on your own. You needed someone younger. You needed someone who constantly bragged about his deep understanding of software and digital networks." I turned my gaze directly to Andre. He had been sitting near the middle of the table, trying to make himself look as small as physically possible. The moment I made eye contact with him, he physically flinched. I clicked the remote again. The slide transitioned to a deeply complex spreadsheet filled with data points, timestamps, MAC addresses, and server routing logs. "My lead forensic accountant is one of the best in the state of Georgia," I explained calmly. It took him less than an hour to pull the digital footprint of the loan origination file. The IP address used to finalize the forged digital signature did not come from your house, Richard. It traced back directly to a luxury high-rise condominium in downtown Atlanta. Specifically, it traced to the exact unit currently leased by Jasmine and Andre. Jasmine whipped her head around so fast her neck audibly cracked. She stared at her husband with wide, horrified eyes. "Andre, what did you do?" she shrieked, her voice completely shattering the quiet professionalism of the room. You told me you were helping Dad set up a new email server for his business. You told me it was just administrative work. Andre held up both of his hands, palms facing outward, sweating profusely. Jasmine, baby, listen to me, he stammered, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit that did not exist. Richard told me it was a legitimate family loan. He said Naomi gave him verbal permission and just needed me to expedite the digital paperwork because she was traveling for business. I was just helping out the family. I did not know it was fraud. Do not play the victim, Andre, I snapped, cutting off his pathetic excuses. You did not just fill out a digital form. You actively masked the device ID and attempted to route the confirmation emails through a dummy server to hide the paper trail. That is premeditated digital forgery. For a guy who claims to be a tech visionary, you left a digital footprint the size of a commercial airplane. You practically gift-wrapped the evidence for federal investigators. Andre slumped back into his leather chair, burying his face in his hands. His entire facade as a brilliant startup founder completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate criminal. Richard finally found his voice. It was weak and trembling, completely stripped of its usual arrogant boom. Naomi, please, he begged, gripping the edge of the marble table to keep himself upright. We can handle this internally. You own the debt now. You can just cancel the loan. You can forgive the balance. It is just paper to you. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the house. Just do not bring the authorities into this. I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I looked at the man who had thrown me out into the freezing rain, the man who had called my brilliant son a worthless mistake. I looked at the mother who had silently watched it happen, and the sister who had happily taken my bedroom the very next day. You are deeply confused about the nature of this gathering, Richard, I said, keeping my tone absolutely flat and devoid of any emotion. You walked into my corporate headquarters today, expecting a family meeting. You expected a negotiation. You thought you could sit in my executive chair, put your feet on my table, and leverage our shared genetics to secure a massive financial bailout. I leaned forward, placing both of my hands firmly on the polished marble. I locked eyes with him, ensuring he felt the full devastating weight of my words. This is not a family meeting, I stated clearly. This is a formal legal notification. I gestured to Elias, who stepped forward and pushed a thick stack of stapled documents across the table toward Richard. That is your official notice of default and impending foreclosure. Elias explained, his voice purely professional and detached. Since NW Holdings now owns your debt, we are legally exercising our right to call the entire principal balance due immediately. You have 72 hours to vacate the primary residence. If you do not comply, the local sheriff will physically remove you and your belongings from the premises. Brenda let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping her head onto the table and sobbing uncontrollably. The reality of losing her home, her status, and her entire identity was finally crashing over her. And as for the forged loan, I continued, my voice rising just enough to be heard over Brenda's crying. My legal team has already compiled the forensic audit, the IP logs, and the false digital certificates into a comprehensive dossier. Tomorrow morning, Elias will hand-deliver that dossier directly to the federal authorities. We are filing a formal police report for felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. Richard gasped, clutching his chest, as if he had just been physically shot. You are sending your own father to federal prison, he whispered, his eyes wide with absolute terror. I am not sending you anywhere, Richard, I replied smoothly. You bought your own ticket the second you decided to steal my identity. I am simply handing the itinerary over to the FBI. You chained yourself to a sinking ship out of pure greed, and now you are going to drown. And the best part is, I will not lose a single second of sleep watching you go under. The absolute finality of my words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds before the entire room violently exploded. The fragile alliance that had held my toxic family together for decades, shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. There was no loyalty among parasites when the host finally cut them off. It was not Richard who broke the silence. It was Jasmine. But she did not rush to comfort her father. She did not express a single ounce of concern that the man who raised her and handed her everything on a silver platter was staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. Instead, she turned on him with the vicious ferocity of a starving and cornered predator. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls of the boardroom. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the marble table, glaring at Richard with absolute hatred. "You lied to me. You sat in my living room and promised me that $50,000 was completely secured. You told me the Buckhead house was a done deal." Richard looked at his youngest daughter, his golden child, in a state of profound shock. "Jasmine, sweetheart, please keep your voice down," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "I was trying to protect the family. I was trying to buy us some time so I could fix the business." "Fix the business!" Jasmine screamed, a harsh, ugly laugh tearing from her throat. "You do not have a business. You are bankrupt. You are losing the house. And because of your pathetic, massive ego, you just lost my house too. I already told the realtor we were wiring the escrow funds tomorrow morning. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is going to be for me? I have to be out of my condo by Friday, and I have absolutely nowhere to go because my father is a complete and total failure." She did not care about the fraud. She did not care about the identity theft. She only cared that her personal ATM had permanently run dry. Richard shrank back into his chair, visibly withering under the sheer venom of the daughter he had spent his entire life elevating above me. But the implosion was only just beginning. Andre, realizing that the sinking ship was currently on fire and completely out of lifeboats, decided it was time to save his own skin. The arrogant tech bro facade completely vanished. He snapped his laptop shut with trembling hands and shoved it into his leather messenger bag. He stood up quickly, taking 2 large steps away from Richard, as if standing too close to him would result in immediate arrest. "Naomi, you have to listen to me," Andre pleaded, his voice high and frantic. He completely ignored Richard and directed his desperate begging straight at me and Elias. "I was manipulated. I am just the son-in-law. Richard told me he had your full verbal authorization to process that secondary loan. He told me it was an emergency bridge loan to keep the family solvent. He explicitly threatened to cut Jasmine out of his will if I did not help him bypass the digital security protocols." "You spineless little coward," Richard roared, suddenly finding a burst of desperate adrenaline. He lunged out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at Andre. "You are the one who set up the proxy servers. You are the one who told me it was completely untraceable. You said you knew how to mask the IP addresses. You wanted that money just as badly as I did to fund your pathetic, useless software app. I will testify against him," Andre yelled over Richard, shouting, speaking directly to Elias. "I will be a cooperating state witness. I will give the federal investigators the encryption keys, the unedited server logs, and all the email correspondence. I have it all backed up on a separate hard drive. I will give you everything you need to lock him away for a decade. Just please, I am begging you, leave my name off the formal complaint. Do not send me to federal prison." "You backstabbing snake," Richard bellowed, taking a threatening step toward Andre. Andre immediately ducked behind an empty leather boardroom chair, holding his hands up in surrender, while Jasmine continued to scream at both of them, demanding to know where she was supposed to sleep on Friday night. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the absolute carnage unfold. It was the most beautiful, chaotic symphony I had ever heard. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. I just had to show them the mirror and let their own inherent toxicity do the rest. They were tearing each other limb from limb, sacrificing their own flesh and blood without a second of hesitation just to save themselves. It validated every boundary I had ever set. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that cutting them out of my life was not just necessary for my success, but vital for my survival. Brenda sat frozen in her chair watching her husband and her son-in-law nearly come to blows, while her favorite daughter screamed about real estate. Her perfect curated country club world had completely vaporized. She looked at the screaming faces of her family and finally realized that none of them possessed the power to save her. The men were facing federal indictments, and her golden child was entirely consumed by her own selfish rage. Brenda's eyes slowly drifted across the chaotic room until they locked onto mine. She saw me standing there calm, untouched, and holding the absolute authority over her entire existence. The survival instinct of a narcissist is a truly terrifying thing to witness. Brenda did not try to defend her husband. She did not try to comfort her panicking daughter. Instead, she slid out of her executive leather chair and sank down toward the floor. She literally dropped to her knees on the cold, polished marble. The bright floral fabric of her expensive designer dress pooled around her as she began to crawl forward, sobbing hysterically. Black mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark lines, completely ruining her immaculate makeup. "Naomi, please." Brenda wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured agony. She reached her hands out toward me, her fingers trembling. "Please do not do this to us. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I gave you life. You cannot destroy your own family like this. We made mistakes, but we are still your blood. Have mercy on us. Please, Naomi, I am begging you as your mother." The boardroom suddenly fell dead silent. Richard, Andre, and Jasmine all stopped screaming and turned to watch the matriarch of the family groveling on the floor, weeping for salvation at the feet of the daughter she had so ruthlessly discarded. I did not step back. I did not reach out to help her up. I stood tall, looking down at the weeping woman kneeling on my marble floor. I felt the phantom chill of a freezing November night wash over my skin. I looked down at her and tilted my head slightly. "Where was this energy when I was 18 years old, Brenda?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying dead calm that echoed through the silent room. Where was this desperate maternal love when I was sitting in the emergency room completely alone, terrified that I was going to lose my baby because I had not eaten a real meal in 3 days? Brenda choked on a sob, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Oh, right," I said, offering her a smile composed entirely of ice. "You were busy buying Jasmine her first Rolex for making the high school honor roll. You are not my mother, Brenda. You are just the woman who gave birth to me before throwing me to the wolves. And now the wolves are here for you." I stepped around Brenda as she continued to weep on the floor. Her theatrical sobs echoed off the glass walls, but I completely tuned her out. I walked back to the head of the massive marble table where Richard was still slumped in the executive chair. He looked like a deflated balloon. The tailored navy pinstripe suit that had looked so sharp and authoritative just 30 minutes ago now hung on his frame like a cheap costume. His face was pale, his breathing was shallow, and the arrogant fire that had burned in his eyes for my entire life was completely extinguished. I looked at Elias and gave him a short nod. My attorney stepped forward and produced one final document from his leather briefcase. It was a thin, crisp folder containing a heavily vetted settlement agreement. He placed it squarely on the table right in front of Richard. I picked up my gold-plated fountain pen, removing the cap with a soft, metallic click. I held the pen out, offering it to the man who had once told me I was entirely worthless. "I am going to give you exactly one chance to dictate how the rest of your life plays out, Richard." I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "I am offering you 2 options, and neither of them involves you walking out of this building with your pride intact." Richard stared blindly at the gold pen in my hand. He did not move to take it. "Option 1. I continued, holding up a single finger. "We end this meeting right now. Elias walks out of those glass doors, drives directly to the federal courthouse, and hands over the complete forensic dossier. Before the sun sets today, federal agents will arrive at your house. They will place you in handcuffs in front of your entire affluent neighborhood. You will be indicted for felony wire fraud and identity theft. Given your age and the sheer amount of financial damage you attempted to inflict, you will spend your senior years sitting in a federal penitentiary. You will lose your house, your freedom, and whatever pathetic shreds of your reputation you have left. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He looked at Elias, who simply stared back with the cold, detached expression of a legal executioner. Option 2, I said, raising a second finger. You take this pen, and you sign the document sitting in front of you. I tapped the thick parchment paper with my manicured fingernail. By signing this, you are agreeing to an immediate and uncontested surrender of your estate. You will voluntarily sign over every single remaining liquid asset in your name. Every checking account, every hidden savings account, and the meager remains of your corporate holdings will be transferred to NW Holdings by the end of the business day. Furthermore, you and Brenda will completely vacate the primary residence by exactly 5 o'clock this Friday afternoon. You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter, and you will walk away. Richard let out a ragged, desperate breath. Naomi, you cannot leave us with absolutely nothing, he whispered, his voice cracking. How are we supposed to survive? Where are we supposed to go? That is the exact same question I asked you 17 years ago. Richard, I replied without a single ounce of pity. You told me to figure it out. I highly suggest you take your own advice. I leaned closer, resting both hands on the table, trapping him in my gaze. But there is one final condition to option 2. I added, my tone turning to absolute steel. The document includes a permanent, legally binding non-contact order. From the second the ink dries on this page, you, Brenda, Jasmine, and Andre will never attempt to contact me or Jamal ever again. You will not call. You will not text. You will not show up at my gates. If I ever see your faces within 500 feet of my family, I will immediately unseal the FBI dossier, and I will bury you. I held the gold pen out an inch closer to his chest. Choose Richard. He looked frantically around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. He looked at Brenda, who was still rocking back and forth on the floor, completely useless to him. He looked at Andre, who actively avoided his gaze, staring fixedly at the blank projection screen. Finally, Richard looked at Jasmine, his golden child, the daughter he had sacrificed everything to please. Jasmine, tell her, he pleaded, his voice thick with desperation. Tell your sister she is taking this too far. Jasmine crossed her arms tightly over her chest and took a physical step backward, distancing herself from him. Do not drag me into this, she snapped, her face twisting with bitter resentment. You lied to me. You ruined my life. Just sign the papers and get it over with so I can figure out how to save myself. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow. The absolute realization crashed down on him with devastating clarity. He had spent his entire life elevating Jasmine and tearing me down. And in his darkest hour, his favorite child was looking at him with nothing but disgust. He was entirely alone. His manufactured power, his patriarchal dominance, his financial superiority. It was all a complete illusion, and it had just evaporated into thin air. Richard reached out his hand, trembling violently. His fingers brushed against mine as he took the gold fountain pen. The man who used to terrify me with a single shout was now shaking so hard he could barely hold the instrument. He looked down at the settlement agreement. He did not read the terms. He did not ask Elias to clarify the legal jargon. He knew he had absolutely no leverage. He pressed the gold nib to the signature line. The sound of the pen scratching against the thick paper was the only noise in the room. It was the sound of a tyrant formally surrendering his crown. He signed his name. Then, his hand shaking even worse, he signed Brenda's name as her legally designated power of attorney. When he was finished, he dropped the pen onto the marble table. It clattered loudly, rolling to a stop near my hand. Richard slumped back into the chair, burying his face in his hands. He looked old, broken, and completely defeated. I picked up the pen calmly, replacing the cap and sliding it back into the pocket of my blazer. Elias immediately stepped forward, pulling the signed documents away and securing them back inside his leather briefcase. The transaction was complete. The empire he had tried to build on a foundation of lies and theft was officially mine. Elias snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut. The sharp metallic sound signaled the absolute end of Richard and Brenda's reign. My two security guards stepped forward, pulling Richard up by his arms and forcing him to his feet. He reached down and dragged a sobbing Brenda off the marble floor. They did not look back at me. Look. They shuffled out of the boardroom, their heads bowed, completely stripped of their dignity and their power. But the room was not empty. I turned back to the massive marble table and saw Jasmine and Andre still standing there. They had not followed my parents out the door. Instead, they lingered near the leather chairs, shifting their weight nervously. Jasmine took a step toward me, her face suddenly undergoing a miraculous transformation. The bitter, angry scowl she had worn while screaming at Richard melted away entirely. In its place, she plastered on a sickeningly sweet and desperate smile. She reached out her hands, as if she were going to pull me into a warm, sisterly embrace. Naomi. Thank God that is finally over, Jasmine breathed, letting out a heavy, manufactured sigh. I cannot believe Dad would do something so horrible to you. Andre and I are just completely sick to our stomachs. We had absolutely no idea he was running a criminal operation behind our backs. It is honestly disgusting. Andre immediately stepped up right beside her, nodding his head vigorously in agreement. Absolutely, Naomi. Andre chimed in, his voice practically dripping with fake sincerity. Richard completely manipulated us. He used my technical skills under false pretenses. I thought I was just doing basic IT work for his contracting firm. We are the victims here just as much as you are. I stood there staring at the two of them. They had just watched Richard sign away his entire life to avoid a federal prison sentence, and their immediate instinct was to step right over his corporate corpse and ask for a handout. The sheer boundless depths of their greed was almost scientifically fascinating to witness. We are so glad you cut the dead weight, Naomi. Jasmine continued, taking another step closer. Dad was dragging all of us down. But now that he is out of the picture, we can finally focus on the future. We are blood, Naomi. You and me. And since you just absorbed all of Dad's assets, I know you have the liquidity to help us out. We do not even need the Buckhead house right now. Just wire us the $50,000 to clear our condo eviction and cover Andre's seed funding. We can be a real family now, just the three of us. I looked at her perfectly styled hair, her designer clothes, and the absolute emptiness in her eyes. She genuinely believed she could throw our parents under the bus, rebrand herself as my loyal sister, and walk out of my skyscraper with a massive wire transfer. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small presentation remote. I pointed it at the projector screen behind me and clicked a single button. The screen flashed, shifting from the forensic audit to a massive high-definition screenshot of an encrypted text message thread. The messages were dated 3 weeks prior. I turned my head and locked eyes with Andre. You claimed you thought you were doing basic IT work, Andre, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. Read the screen. Read it out loud for your wife. Andre looked up at the projection. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he was going to pass out. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I will read it for you, I offered, stepping forward and pointing at the massive text bubbles. Message from Andre to Richard. Quote, the IP proxy is fully established. I bypassed the dual-factor authentication using Naomi's old social. The digital signature is locked in. Just make sure she never finds out or we are both looking at federal time. End quote. Jasmine let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She turned to look at Andre, her eyes wide with fresh, absolute horror. You are not a victim, Andre, I said, turning my full attention to him. You were a willing and eager co-conspirator. You knew exactly what you were doing. You facilitated the felony identity theft because Richard promised you a cut of the loan to fund your failing, pathetic software app. My forensic team recovered every single deleted message from your cloud backup. Andre stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of a boardroom chair. Naomi, please, he begged, his voice cracking in pure terror. I was desperate. My investors pulled out. I was going to lose everything. You did lose everything, I corrected smoothly. Elias did not hand the dossier over to the federal authorities today because Richard signed the settlement agreement. But I kept a fully verified duplicate copy of the entire digital footprint. Every single IP log, every text message, and every forged certificate with your name attached to it is sitting in a fireproof safe in my office. If you ever ask me for money again, if you ever text me another real estate listing, if you ever breathe in my general direction, I will personally drive that hard drive down to the FBI field office and I will make sure you share a cell block with Richard. I turned to Jasmine. She was shaking violently, staring at me as if I were a ghost. And you? I said, my voice slicing through the air like a blade. You sat at my dining room table and demanded I pay you for the stress of my teenage pregnancy. You stood on my driveway and demanded the keys to my guest house. You have spent your entire life feeding off the destruction of my self-esteem. You are not my sister. You are a parasite who just lost her host. I raised my left arm and pushed up the sleeve of my blazer, exposing my diamond wristwatch. You have exactly 30 seconds to leave my corporate headquarters, I announced. If you are still standing in this room when I reach 0, my security team will physically drag you out to the street and toss you onto the sidewalk. Jasmine and Andre just stood there, completely paralyzed by shock. 30, I said loudly, staring right through them. 29. 28. The countdown broke the spell. Andre let out a panicked whimper. He grabbed his leather messenger bag from the table and practically sprinted toward the glass doors of the boardroom. Jasmine snapped out of her trance and chased right after him, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished hardwood floors. You absolute idiot, Jasmine screamed at him as they burst through the glass doors. You ruined my life. You promised me we were getting that money. I followed them, slowly stepping out of the boardroom and watching them from the hallway. They were completely unhinged, standing in the center of my pristine corporate reception area, screaming at the top of their lungs. I ruined your life, Andre yelled back, his face red and sweating. You are the one who maxed out 5 credit cards on designer clothes and luxury vacations while I was trying to build a company. We are getting evicted because of your insane spending habits, Jasmine. I am filing for divorce, Jasmine shrieked, swinging her heavy leather handbag and hitting him squarely in the shoulder. I am not going down for your federal crimes. You are a pathetic, broke loser. My executive assistant stood quietly behind the reception desk, watching the spectacular implosion of their marriage with mild professional amusement. 2 security guards flanked the elevator banks, arms crossed over their chests, waiting for the chaotic couple to leave. Andre hit the elevator button repeatedly, frantically trying to escape the building and his screaming wife. The stainless steel doors slid open. They both shoved their way inside, still shouting vicious insults at each other. Jasmine was crying hysterically. Her makeup completely ruined her perfect golden child facade, completely shattered. The heavy metal doors slid shut, cutting off their screaming and sealing their fate. They were going back to an empty bank account, a pending eviction notice, and the absolute ruins of their manufactured lives. I stood in the quiet hallway, taking a deep, cleansing breath. The toxic dead weight was finally gone. I was completely free. Exactly 1 month passed since the heavy stainless steel elevator doors closed on Jasmine and Andre, sealing their fate and confirming my absolute freedom. The swift and merciless execution of the settlement agreement happened exactly as Elias had promised. Richard and Brenda had 72 hours to pack whatever meager personal belongings they could fit into a rented moving truck. They surrendered their keys, they surrendered their assets, and they surrendered the manufactured elite identity they had spent decades building. I did not ask where they went, and I genuinely did not care. My only directive to my legal team was to ensure the permanent non-contact order was ruthlessly enforced. Now, 30 days later, I was standing on the pristine sidewalk of that same affluent suburban neighborhood. The morning air was crisp and cool, biting at my cheeks, but I felt perfectly warm inside my tailored wool cashmere coat. I stood across the street from the massive 5-bedroom house where I had spent the first 18 years of my life. It looked different now. Without Brenda's obsessive daily landscaping and Richard's desperate attempts to project wealth, The property already looked hollow and entirely lifeless. The lawn was overgrown, the expensive flower beds were choked with weeds, and the custom oak front doors were completely bare. I kept my eyes locked on the front porch. It was a wide, sweeping concrete structure framed by thick colonial pillars. My mind briefly flashed back to that freezing November night 17 years ago. I could almost see the ghost of my 18-year-old self standing there shivering violently, clutching a black plastic trash bag filled with my clothes. I remembered the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place, locking me out in the cold. I remembered pleading through the thick glass of the window, begging my father not to throw me away. But the memory held absolutely no power over me anymore. The ghost of that terrified pregnant teenager was gone, replaced by the woman standing on the sidewalk today, a woman who owned the very ground that house was built on. A sleek black Tesla pulled up smoothly to the curb right beside me. The passenger door opened and Jamal stepped out. He was wearing a casual gray sweater and dark jeans, a stark contrast to his usual elite prep school uniform. He walked over and stood right beside me, slipping his hands into his pockets. He looked across the street at the sprawling, silent house. "Are we on schedule, Mom?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Right on time," I replied, keeping my eyes on the property. At exactly 8 in the morning, the deep rumbling roar of heavy diesel engines shattered the quiet serenity of the affluent neighborhood. I watched as a massive yellow excavator flanked by two large commercial dump trucks slowly rolled down the manicured street. The heavy steel tracks of the machinery clanked loudly against the pavement, drawing the attention of several wealthy neighbors who began peeking out from behind their expensive silk curtains. The demolition crew did not waste any time. The foreman, a burly man wearing a bright orange reflective vest and a white hard hat, walked onto the overgrown lawn. He looked across the street, made eye contact with me, and gave a sharp, respectful nod. I returned the gesture, giving him the silent authorization to proceed. The foreman blew a sharp blast on his whistle and pointed toward the colonial pillars. The massive yellow excavator rolled forward, its heavy metal tracks tearing deep, jagged gashes into Brenda's previously perfect front lawn. The machine raised its massive, articulated steel arm high into the air, positioning the heavy iron claw directly over the roof of the grand entryway. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs. The iron claw slammed downward with bone-rattling force. The impact sounded like a bomb going off in the quiet neighborhood. The pristine slate roof completely caved in, sending a massive plume of gray dust and splintered wood exploding into the air. The heavy colonial pillars buckled and snapped under the immense pressure, collapsing inward. I watched without a single ounce of pity as the exact porch where I had been discarded was violently crushed into a pile of unrecognizable rubble. The excavator swung its arm again, tearing through the master bedroom, where Richard and Brenda had slept for 20 years. The floor-to-ceiling windows shattered into thousands of tiny glittering fragments, raining down onto the crushed azalea bushes below. The structural beams groaned and snapped, the entire facade of the house peeling away to reveal the empty, hollow rooms inside. It was a spectacular display of absolute destruction, tearing down a fortress that had been built entirely on a foundation of lies, abuse, and narcissistic delusion. I looked at Jamal. He was watching the demolition with a quiet, peaceful smile on his face. He was not cheering or gloating. He was simply watching the physical manifestation of justice. The boy Richard had called a worthless mistake was standing safely on the sidewalk, watching Richard's entire legacy being ground into dust. "It is loud," Jamal noted casually, as a massive section of brick wall collapsed into the foundation with a deafening crash. "Progress usually is," I replied, resting my hand gently on his shoulder. I had not just ordered the house to be torn down for the sake of petty revenge. Vengeance is temporary, but legacy is permanent. I had spent the last 30 days working closely with the City Planning Commission to officially rezone the entire 2-acre residential lot. We had pushed the paperwork through, rapidly leveraging the massive influence and capital of NW Holdings. This prime piece of affluent real estate was no longer zoned for a single-family mansion. I was transforming the space. By this time next year, a brand new state-of-the-art commercial building would stand on this exact spot. It was going to be a high-tech incubator and educational center specifically designed for underprivileged youth in the greater Atlanta area. It would be fully funded and permanently endowed by my corporate holding company. Teenagers who had been told they were worthless teenagers who had been thrown out of their homes. Teenagers who felt like they had absolutely no future would come to this facility. They would learn how to code, how to build software architecture, and how to secure venture capital. They would be given the exact tools and resources I had been violently denied. Jamal had even spent his evenings drafting the initial blueprints for the server rooms. He planned to spend his summer before heading off to Columbia University, teaching the introductory machine learning seminars in the very building that would replace his abuser's home. We were taking a monument to generational trauma and completely bulldozing it to build a launch pad for generational wealth. The excavator engine roared again, dragging a massive pile of shattered drywall and broken brick toward the waiting dump trucks. The air was thick with the smell of pulverized concrete and old timber. The house was completely gone. There was nothing left but a gaping hole in the ground and a pile of debris waiting to be hauled away to a landfill. I stood there for a few more minutes watching the dust slowly settle over the empty lot. The dark shadow that had loomed over my entire life was finally erased. The slate was completely wiped clean. I turned away from the empty lot and began walking back toward the car. The heavy diesel engines of the excavators faded into the background, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of my own footsteps. For the first time in 17 years, my chest felt entirely light. The chronic invisible weight I had been carrying since the night I was thrown out into the freezing rain was completely gone. I slid into the driver's side of the Tesla, and Jamal got into the passenger seat. He looked over at me and gave me a soft, knowing smile. We did not need to say anything else. The silence between us was comfortable and profoundly safe. As I drove us back to our estate, I let my mind wander over the events of the past month and the monumental shift that had taken place in my life. People often misunderstand the true nature of revenge. Society frequently tells us that revenge is a burning, destructive fire. They tell us that seeking vengeance makes you just as bad as the people who hurt you, and that the only path to true healing is absolute, unconditional forgiveness. They want you to turn the other cheek and let the toxic people back into your life under the guise of being the bigger person. But I completely disagree with that narrative. True revenge is not about matching their cruelty. It is not about sinking to their level or destroying them just for the pure sake of inflicting pain. True revenge is about taking back the pen they used to write your narrative and crossing out their names. Revenge is about neutralizing their power so completely and so thoroughly that they become entirely irrelevant to your peace. When Richard and Brenda showed up at my front gate, they firmly believed they still held the power to intimidate me. They believed the frightened 18-year-old girl was still hiding inside my chest, just waiting to be scolded into submission. But by systematically dismantling their financial facade, by exposing their criminal fraud, and legally severing their ties to my life, I did not just punish them. I permanently revoked their access to my energy. I took away the only weapon they had left, which was their manufactured authority over my worth. I do not check up on them anymore. I have not hired private investigators to track down where Richard and Brenda are currently renting, or if they are living in a motel. I do not care if Jasmine and Andre managed to salvage their failing marriage, or if they ended up sleeping on a friend's couch while dodging their own creditors. The opposite of love is not hate. Hate requires a massive amount of emotional investment and time. The true opposite of love is absolute indifference. And as I drove down the highway, heading back to the beautiful, luxurious life I had built with my own two hands, I realized I had finally achieved complete indifference toward the people who shared my DNA. They were just ghosts haunting a past I no longer lived in, and they were no longer invited to my future. The space they used to occupy in my mind is now filled with incredible potential. It is filled with the blueprints for the new youth tech incubator that will stand on the ruins of their arrogance. It is filled with the knowledge that hundreds of kids who feel discarded, who have been told they are worthless, will walk through the doors of that facility and learn how to build their own empires. We are taking the exact location of my deepest trauma and transforming it into a beacon of generational healing. I broke the cycle of abuse and replaced it with a cycle of fierce empowerment. And most importantly, that space in my heart is filled with my son. I glanced over at Jamal, who was already pulling out his tablet to review his latest coding project for his early admission program. Richard called him a mistake. Brenda wanted me to erase him to protect their country club reputation. But looking at him now, a brilliant, kind, and fiercely independent young man heading to an Ivy League university, I know he is the greatest blessing of my entire existence. He is the living, breathing proof that their judgment was fundamentally flawed. Jamal taught me the most valuable lesson I have ever learned about human connection. He taught me that biology does not automatically grant you a seat at the table. Blood simply dictates the initial biological lottery you are born into. It does not dictate who you are obligated to tolerate for the rest of your life. Family is not just a shared last name or a matching set of genetic markers. Family is defined entirely by actions. Family is who holds your hand when you are sitting in a freezing car with absolutely nothing to your name. Family is who believes in your potential when the rest of the world tells you that you are a worthless statistic. Family is who protects your peace, not who demands your wallet the absolute second you achieve success. Jamal is my family. The loyal friends who helped me study for my real estate exams while I was waitressing double shifts are my family. The mentors who guided me through my first commercial acquisitions when I was just a young black woman trying to break into a male-dominated industry are my family. I built a beautiful, thriving village entirely from scratch, and I will fiercely defend the gates of that village against anyone who tries to bring their toxicity inside. It took me 17 years to realize that the rejection I suffered at 18 was not a punishment. It was a brutal, agonizing, but ultimately necessary redirection. The universe removed me from a toxic environment so I could learn how to survive in the wild. And once I learned how to survive, I learned how to conquer. If you are watching this right now, and you are currently trapped in a cycle of family abuse or manipulation, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your abusers your success. You do not owe them your peace of mind. And you certainly do not owe them a place in your future just because they happen to be present in your past. It is incredibly painful to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. But the freedom you find on the other side of that grief is worth every single tear you shed. Do not let anyone guilt-trip you into keeping toxic people in your life simply because you share a bloodline. Family isn't blood. Family is who holds your hand when you have nothing, not who demands your wallet when you have everything. Jamal is my family. Have you ever had to draw a permanent line in the sand with toxic relatives? Let me know your story in the comments below. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I'll see you in the next video.